Ancient Egypt, 3600 BC. The sun is blazing over the Nile Delta, and thousands of people are on their knees, not because they were forced to, because they want to be. There's a figure at the center of it all, a being draped in royal cloth, surrounded by 4 warriors, his voice carrying something older than language. He steps into a pyramid. The ground shakes, stone rises. Massive granite blocks lift without hands, without machines, without explanation, and the crowd below doesn't run. They worship. Because to them what they're witnessing isn't terrifying, it's divine. That's the opening of X-Men, Apocalypse. And whether the movie fully delivers on the promise of that image or not, and we're going to talk honestly about both sides of that, the image itself is extraordinary. A mutant so powerful, so ancient, that human civilization didn't just fear him, it built religions around him. It called him God, Osiris, Ra, Krishna, Yahweh. Different names, same idea. The first mutant, the strongest there ever was. Sabah, The Apocalypse. Released in May 2016, X-Men Apocalypse was the 9th film in Fox's X-Men franchise, a franchise that had been running for 16 years at that point and had pulled off one of the more remarkable comeback stories in superhero cinema history. Just 2 years earlier, X-Men Days of Future Past had essentially reset the entire timeline, erased the events of X-Men, The Last Stand, and given Bryan Singer's series a second life. Critics loved it. Audiences loved it. It made $746 million worldwide and won a Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film. The franchise was in the best shape it had been in since the original 2000 film. So the pressure on Apocalypse was real. This wasn't just the next X-Men movie. It was supposed to be the culmination of the prequel trilogy that began with X-Men First Class in 2011. The one where Charles Xavier becomes Professor X. The one where Eric Lenshier fully becomes Magneto. The one where the X-Men, the actual X-Men, the ones we grew up watching in Saturday morning cartoons, are finally born. And to mark the occasion, Bryan Singer and screenwriter Simon Kinberg reached back to one of the most iconic villains in all of X-Men mythology, Apocalypse, the immortal mutant who had been conquering and culling the human race for thousands of years. On paper, it sounded perfect. On screen, it's more complicated than that, and that's exactly why it's worth talking about. Here's the thing about X-Men Apocalypse. It's a movie that's genuinely fascinating to analyze, not always because it succeeds, but because of why it succeeds when it does, and why it stumbles when it doesn't. It's a film carrying an enormous amount of weight. It has to introduce a new generation of X-Men. It has to give Michael Fassbender's Magneto a story worthy of his previous 2 outings. It has to make Oscar Isaac, one of the most talented actors alive, feel like the most terrifying villain the franchise has ever produced. And it has to do all of this while blowing up Cairo, staging a slow-motion sequence set to Eurythmics, and finding room for Hugh Jackman to appear as a berserker in a laboratory hallway. That's a lot, maybe too much. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand Apocalypse, you have to understand where the X-Men series was in 2016, and more importantly, where it thought it was going. X-Men First Class had done something genuinely surprising back in 2011. Directed by Matthew Vaughn, it had stripped the franchise back to its roots, set it against the backdrop of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and made it feel like a period spy thriller crossed with a superhero origin story. James McAvoy as the young, idealistic Charles Xavier and Michael Fassbender as the cold, ruthless Eric Lenshier weren't just solid choices. They were revelations. Their chemistry, equal parts intellectual rivalry, genuine friendship, and inevitable ideological collision, gave the film an emotional core that had nothing to do with capes or cosmic powers. It was about 2 men with fundamentally different answers to the same question. How do you survive in a world that fears what you are? Days of Future Past kept that energy alive. It brought the original cast back, gave Hugh Jackman one of his best performances as the time-traveling Wolverine, and built to a finale that genuinely felt like it meant something. By the end of that film, the timeline had been rewritten. The X-Men lived. Jean Grey stood in the sunlight at the school, alive and safe. The future was open. Apocalypse is set a decade after Days of Future Past. It's 1983. The Cold War is still cold. Ronald Reagan is in the White House. Mutantkind is not openly celebrated, but it isn't being hunted the way it was in the dystopian future we'd just escaped. Charles Xavier is running his school. Eric has disappeared into Poland. Raven, Mystique, has become an underground legend in the mutant community, a symbol of resistance even as she resists that role herself. And somewhere underneath the sands of Egypt, a burial chamber has been disturbed. The film's central premise is deceptively simple. Apocalypse. This ancient, immortal mutant was entombed by his own followers thousands of years ago during a failed ritual. Now he's been awakened. He's confused by the modern world for approximately 45 seconds. Then he's not confused anymore. He finds 4 mutants, gives them enhanced powers, calls them his horsemen, and sets about his plan to destroy civilization and rebuild it in the image of the strong. That's the threat. That's what the X-Men have to stop. But here's what makes this movie genuinely interesting to dissect. The real story isn't about stopping Apocalypse. Not really. The real story is about 3 separate mutant beings who are all wrestling with the same fundamental question, each in their own way: who am I, and what am I supposed to do with what I am? Charles Xavier, running his school, living his dream, genuinely believing in the best of both humans and mutants. Eric Lenscher, who truly tried, to walk away from everything. To be a factory worker in Poland, to have a family, to be normal. And Jean Grey, a teenage girl at Xavier's school who can hear every mind on the planet, who loses control of her power every night in her dreams, who is more afraid of herself than of anything the world might throw at her. These 3 characters are the soul of X-Men, Apocalypse. And the film is at its absolute best when it remembers that. Bryan Singer had been directing X-Men movies since 2000. The original film is what kicked off the modern superhero era. You could make a legitimate argument that without X-Men, without Singer's grounded, character-first approach to a story about people with powers being feared by the world around them, you don't get the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it. You don't get Iron Man. The genre trajectory shifts. That's how influential the original film was. By 2016, Singer was a veteran working with material he'd helped create, and you can see that in Apocalypse. There's a confidence in the staging of this world. The school in Westchester has never felt more alive. There are kids using their powers in the hallways, a classroom where Charles is discussing mutation as the next step in human evolution, a danger room that's still under construction. The world feels inhabited, lived in. The 1983 setting is used thoughtfully, not just as an aesthetic choice, but as a thematic one. The Cold War provides a backdrop of mutually assured destruction that rhymes perfectly with Apocalypse's philosophy: survival of the fittest, or extinction of everyone. Simon Kinberg's screenplay is ambitious. Sometimes the ambition is the problem. There are stretches of Apocalypse where you can feel the seams straining under the weight of everything it's trying to do simultaneously. But the structure itself is sound. The film commits to its ensemble. It doesn't shortchange its new characters to service the returning ones. And it makes a choice, bold in context, to end not with the old guard triumphant, but with a new team standing in the rubble wearing new uniforms ready to begin. That's not an accident. That's a deliberate passing of the torch. And it's one of the most underappreciated things about this movie. Let's talk about why any of this matters. In 2016, the superhero genre was reaching a kind of saturation point. Captain America: Civil War had come out just days before X-Men: Apocalypse, and it was an enormous critical and commercial hit. Batman v Superman had disappointed critics earlier that spring. The conversation around superhero movies had shifted from "look what they can do" to "is this sustainable?" Critics were beginning to ask harder questions. Are these movies actually saying anything? Or are they just spectacle machines wrapped in character work? X-Men: Apocalypse landed right in the middle of that conversation, and its reception reflected the uncertainty of the moment. Critics were split. Audiences were more forgiving but not quite enthusiastic. The film made $543 million worldwide, profitable but well below Days of Future Past total. The consensus hardened into something like good ideas, uneven execution. That verdict isn't wrong. But it isn't the whole story either. Because here's what gets lost. When we just look at Rotten Tomatoes scores and box office tallies, X-Men: Apocalypse is doing something genuinely difficult. It's trying to honor the mythology of one of the most beloved superhero franchises in comics history, a mythology that includes some of the most complex, morally rich storytelling in the medium, while also working as a $78 million action blockbuster, while also serving as the 3rd chapter of a prequel trilogy, while also introducing characters that fans have been waiting decades to see done right. Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, Nightcrawler, on screen in ways that feel true to who those characters actually are. Does it pull all of that off? Not entirely, but the attempt is worth taking seriously. And the places where it works, and there are real places where it works, are worth examining closely. That's what this essay is about. We're going to walk through X-Men: Apocalypse from the ground up. We'll look at how its story is constructed, what it's actually trying to say underneath all the visual chaos, why certain characters land and others don't. We're going to spend serious time on Michael Fassbender's Magneto because his arc in this film is without question, the most emotionally resonant thing in it. We're going to examine Oscar Isaac's Apocalypse with honest eyes, what works, what doesn't, and why the gap between the concept and the execution reveals something important about how superhero cinema builds its villains. We're going to look at the technical craft, at Newton Thomas Sigel's cinematography, at John Ottman's score, at the VFX sequences that genuinely earned their budgets, and the ones that felt like digital noise. And we're going to talk about what this movie meant for the franchise, where it sent the X-Men, what it set up, and how it holds up now that the Fox era is over and these characters have been absorbed into the Disney universe. It's a big film, it has big problems, it has big ambitions, and some of those ambitions hit harder than anything else in the franchise. In ancient Egypt, thousands of people knelt because they believed something extraordinary was standing in front of them. You don't have to kneel for X-Men, Apocalypse. But you should probably look closely at what's actually there. Poland, 1983, a steel mill in the middle of nowhere. A man who could bend the entire building into scrap metal with a thought is hand, welding a support beam like every other worker on the floor. That's how Eric Lenscher chose to disappear. Not with a dramatic retreat, not with a hidden fortress or a manifesto. He just stopped, put down the helmet, changed his name. Found a woman named Magda in a small town near Gdansk, married her, had a daughter named Nina. Built something fragile and quiet and entirely human in the middle of a world that still hadn't decided what to do with people like him. The film doesn't ease you into this, it just shows it to you and trusts you to feel the weight of it immediately. Eric comes home from work and there's Nina, maybe 8 years old, running to him through the yard. She climbs a fence. He catches her. The light is warm and golden in that late afternoon way that movies use when they want you to know something terrible is about to happen. And you know. You absolutely know. But Michael Fassbender plays these scenes with such quiet, earned tenderness that you find yourself hoping anyway. Because that's how good he is. He makes you forget, for just a few minutes, that Eric Lenscher has never once been allowed to keep something he loves. This is the emotional gravity at the center of X-Men Apocalypse. Everything else orbits it. But the film begins, structurally, chronologically, somewhere else entirely. Back in that Egyptian prologue we touched on at the top, it's worth spending real time there now because what happens in those opening 10 minutes does more heavy lifting than most of the film's actual runtime. 3600 BC. Sabah Nur is preparing for a ritual. He's the most powerful mutant alive, maybe the most powerful being alive, full stop. His ability isn't just one thing, that's the terrifying part. He can absorb the powers of other mutants through a kind of psychic transfer, adding their gifts to his own, rebuilding his body in the process. The ritual we're watching involves exactly that, his consciousness and power being transferred into a younger host body inside the pyramid. His Four Horsemen guard the process, thousands of followers chat outside, and then it goes wrong. A faction of those followers, people who feared what he was becoming, people who understood that a god who never dies is a god who never stops accumulating power, collapses the pyramid. The new body is entombed. The horsemen die trying to protect him. Sabah Nur is buried under thousands of tons of stone, suspended in something between death and sleep, waiting. This sequence is visually stunning, and director of photography Newton Thomas Sigel shoots it with a warmth and grandeur that makes ancient Egypt feel genuinely mythological rather than just set-dressed. The production design here, the scale of the ritual chamber, the positioning of the horsemen around the sarcophagus, the way light filters through the pyramid shaft as it collapses, is the movie at its most ambitious and its most successful. These 10 minutes feel like the opening of a different, more mythologically ambitious film, like something Ridley Scott might make on a good day. The point being established is crucial. Apocalypse is not just a powerful mutant. He's a creature of cycle. He has watched civilizations rise and fall. He has been worshipped and betrayed and buried and awakened before. To him, human history is just weather, seasons of strength and weakness. His philosophy, that the strong should rule, that everything built by the weak should be torn down, isn't ideology in the way we understand it. It's just observation. He's seen enough centuries to believe he knows how the world works. That's genuinely interesting as a character concept. The tragedy, and we'll dig deeper into this later, is that the film doesn't always find a way to make that ancient, weary certainty feel viscerally threatening rather than philosophically abstract. Cut to 1983. Cairo, Egypt. A CIA operative named Moira McTaggart is following a lead on a mysterious cult. She descends underground into what appears to be a ceremonial space and witnesses the reawakening ceremony. Followers chanting, sunlight channeled through a buried shaft directly onto the sarcophagus. One of them accidentally falls in, and the ancient thing inside stirs. Rose burns. Moira is a small but important presence in this sequence. She's our eye, the audience surrogate who witnesses the impossible and has no framework for it. She's also the thread that reconnects Charles Xavier to events he'd otherwise have no reason to know about, which becomes relevant in one of the film's more quietly clever plot mechanics. When Charles uses Cerebro to access Moira's memories, he inadvertently wipes the memory of their previous relationship, an echo of what he did to her at the end of First Class, now reversed and accidental rather than calculated. It's a small moment, but it says something real about how Charles relates to the people he cares about, and we'll come back to it. What matters right now is that the seal is broken, Apocalypse is loose, and the film immediately, efficiently begins showing us how he moves through this new world he's woken into. His first act is to walk through Cairo and absorb everything. Television signals, radio broadcasts, newspapers. He stands in a market square processing 60 years of history in a matter of minutes. 2 world wars, nuclear weapons, the space race, mutant registration debates, geopolitical fragmentation. And his reaction isn't horror or confusion. It's recognition. The weak still rule. The strong are still hidden. Everything has changed in the details. Nothing has changed in the structure. This is Oscar Isaac doing what he can with what he's given. There's a moment, just one shot, maybe 3 seconds, where he turns away from a television playing news footage and his eyes carry something genuinely ancient and tired. Isaac threads in this exhaustion beneath the menace, and it's the most interesting choice he makes in the entire film. Apocalypse isn't angry, he's disappointed. The way a doctor is disappointed when a patient refuses treatment they know they need. Then he finds his first horseman, and the recruitment begins. Storm, Psylocke, Angel, Magneto. The film moves through these recruitment sequences with varying degrees of success, and it's worth walking through each one because they reveal something about how Apocalypse actually works. Not through force, but through amplification. He doesn't consciously recruit followers so much as find people who are already broken and offer to make their power equal to their pain. Ororo Munroe is pickpocketing tourists in Cairo's market district when Apocalypse finds her. She's young. Alexandra Shipp plays her as fiercely independent, deeply guarded, running a small gang of street kids with a kind of reluctant protectiveness. When Apocalypse appears in her little room and asks her what she wants, what she really wants, there's no negotiation. He just looks at her. And then he shows her what she can do when someone removes the ceiling on her power. The sky opens, lightning tears across Egypt, and Aurora's eyes go wide. Not with fear, but with something that looks almost like relief, like she's been holding her breath for years and someone finally told her to exhale. It's a brief scene, but Alexandra Shipp communicates everything in it. The tragedy of Storm in this film is that she barely gets a chance to exist before she becomes a horseman costume and a glowing visual effect. There's a much more interesting movie about Ororo Munroe buried inside X-Men, Apocalypse, and that version of Storm would later be partially excavated in the TV spin-off attempts and the eventual character reset. But in this film, she's the one horseman whose potential is most clearly visible and most clearly underserved. Psylocke and Angel get even less. Olivia Munn's Psylocke is all aesthetic, purple telekinetic blade energy, form-fitting tactical suit, a few cool combat moves in the film's third act. There's essentially nothing on screen that tells us who Betsy Braddock is as a person. Angel, Ben Hardy, buried under metal wings and an arc that never quite ignites, gets slightly more screen time but similar thematic emptiness. The Horsemen, as a unit, are a visual concept more than a dramatic one, with the partial exception of Storm, and the film acknowledges this only implicitly by having Apocalypse himself describe his choices as collecting tools rather than companions. Then there's Magneto. And this is where the film becomes something worth watching. We need to go back to Poland. The setup of Eric's life there is economical but genuinely affecting. He's using a fake name. He goes to work. He comes home. He has friends among the mill workers, people who have no idea who he is or what he can do. One evening, a bird lands on Nina's outstretched hand in the woods. Within seconds, every bird in the surrounding forest is gathered around her, responding to her, drawn to her in a way that suggests she has inherited something from her father, not mental manipulation, something biological, empathic, a communion with living things. It's a beautiful moment, quiet and strange and full of the kind of wonder that the best X-Men stories traffic in. The idea that mutation doesn't have to be a weapon, that it can just be a gift, that a little girl talking to birds in a Polish forest is not a threat to anyone, but someone at the mill saw Eric move a piece of metal with his mind during an accident. And fear, as the X-Men films have always understood, travels faster than trust. The local police arrive. They demand that Eric come with them. His wife Magda steps forward. Nina steps forward. Eric is holding it together, barely, visibly, and then one of the officers draws his bow. A warning shot. An accident, an act of nervous, stupid, fear-driven human behavior. And Nina dies. And then Magda dies. And then Eric's control, the thing he has been gripping with both hands for years, the thing he gave up an entire identity to protect, shatters completely. What follows is one of the film's most technically impressive sequences. Eric tears the metal badge from the officer's chest. He levitates it. He uses it. The sound design in this moment is extraordinary. John Ottman's score drops almost entirely out, and what fills the silence is just the thin metallic hiss of that badge cutting through air, and then screaming, and then silence again. Fassbender doesn't speak a word during this scene. He doesn't need to. The grief on his face has its own language, something beyond rage, something beyond grief in the conventional sense. It's the look of a man whose last argument against himself has just been taken away. Eric tried. He genuinely tried the thing Charles always asked him to try. He found love. He made peace. He chose to believe that a normal life was possible, and the world took it from him anyway. So when Apocalypse appears in the ruins of that forest, when that ancient voice says, "I've been looking for someone like you," it doesn't feel like a villain recruiting a weapon. It feels like a drowning man being handed something to hold on to. That's not good. Eric going back to this place, being used this way, is not a moment of triumph. But Fassbender plays it with total commitment, and the film has the intelligence to make Apocalypse's pitch to Magneto explicitly about grief rather than ideology. He doesn't ask Eric to hate humanity. He asks Eric to stop pretending that the effort of loving it is worth the cost. It's genuinely compelling, and it's almost entirely because of Michael Fassbender. Meanwhile, several hundred miles west, in Westchester, New York, a teenager named Scott Summers is having a very bad first day. The school scenes, and there are several of them scattered across Act 1 before the world starts ending, are the film's most purely enjoyable stretch. Not the most emotionally heavy or thematically rich, but the most fun. There's a looseness to them, a sense of genuine discovery and adolescent awkwardness that makes the young cast instantly likable. Scott Summers arrives at Xavier's school with his eyes literally taped shut. His brother, Alec, Havoc, who we've known from earlier films, brings him to Charles because Scott's optic blasts are uncontrollable and have already destroyed a school bathroom and terrified most of his hometown. Ty Sheridan plays Scott's defensiveness brilliantly. He's not sulky in the way movie teenagers often are. He's frightened. Frightened of himself, of what he might do, of the fact that the thing living behind his eyes has already cost him everything normal. Hank McCoy fits Scott with ruby quartz glasses. And the moment Scott opens his eyes and sees the world for the first time in weeks, sharp, clear, undestructive, Sheridan communicates a relief so visceral it almost hurts to watch. This kid just wants to see. That's all. He wants to be in the world without destroying it. That's the X-Men thesis right there. And a kid adjusting his glasses. Jean Grey is already at the school when Scott arrives. Sophie Turner's Jean is a more internally complex introduction. She's been here longer, she's older, and her relationship with her powers is not one of reckless explosiveness, but of constant, exhausting suppression. She hears everything. Every mind in a 50-mile radius, every emotion, every nightmare being dreamed by people she'll never meet. She keeps it all behind a psychic wall that Charles helped her build, and the effort of maintaining that wall is visible in the tension around her eyes, in the way she flinches slightly in crowded spaces, in how she holds herself when she doesn't think anyone's watching. Turner is sometimes underrated in this role. The character is difficult. Jean Grey is one of the most overpowered, over-mythologized characters in the entire X-Men canon, and the trap is to play her as mysterious and tragic from minute one. Turner does something smarter. She plays Jean as tired. Not sad, not brooding, just exhausted by the volume of being alive with her particular gift, which, when you eventually see what she becomes at the end of the film, makes the contrast land so much harder. Nightcrawler arrives from a completely different direction. We first meet Kurt Wagner in a Berlin cage fighting ring, forced to fight Angel for the entertainment of a screaming crowd, fighting with deliberate restraint so his opponent doesn't get hurt too badly. Cody Smith, McPhee plays Kurt with enormous warmth. He's the most immediately likable character in the film. Gentle, devout, a little awkward, constantly astonished by the casual cruelty of the world, and equally astonished by kindness when it appears. Raven rescues him from the cage and eventually brings him to Xavier's school, and from the moment he arrives, the film gets lighter, not cheaper, just more human. By the end of Act 1, these three storylines, Apocalypse's awakening and Horseman recruitment, Eric's devastation and radicalization, the young mutants finding something like home at Xavier's school, have been fully established and are beginning to intersect. Moira's intelligence reaches Charles. Charles reaches out with Cerebro and finds Apocalypse, and what he finds in that consciousness briefly seizes him, pulls him somewhere ancient and enormous and nearly impossible to come back from. The school is no longer a safe harbor. The world is about to get much more dangerous. What's remarkable about this setup, and this is something the film deserves more credit for, is how clearly it establishes its emotional stakes before a single, major action sequence occurs. We know what Eric has lost. We know what Jean is carrying. We know that Scott Summers just wants to see straight. We know that Kurt Wagner is somewhere between a circus act and an angel, and he hasn't fully figured out which yet. These aren't just characters being positioned for plot mechanics, they're people. Flawed, scared, extraordinary people in a world that doesn't know what to do with them. That's the X-Men at their best. And for now, at the end of Act 1, that's exactly what X-Men Apocalypse is delivering. There's a moment about 40 minutes into X-Men Apocalypse where Charles Xavier sits down in front of Cerebro, puts on that helmet, reaches out with his mind, and finds something that nearly kills him. Not physically. Charles isn't in any immediate danger sitting in that underground chamber. But what he touches when he makes contact with Sabah's consciousness is something so vast, so old, so utterly certain of itself that the sheer weight of it nearly pulls him under. James McAvoy sells this beautifully. His face goes slack, his eyes lose focus, and then something else takes over his expression. Something that isn't quite him anymore. A gravity that doesn't belong to this gentle, idealistic man who runs a school for frightened teenagers. He starts speaking with Apocalypse's cadence. His body takes on Apocalypse's posture. Hank McCoy tears the helmet off before it goes further. Charles gasps back to himself. But he knows, now, what they're dealing with. Not a mutant terrorist with a political agenda, not a revolutionary or a warlord. Something older than any of those categories. Something that doesn't distinguish between mutant and human on any meaningful level. To Apocalypse, both are just iterations of life on a planet that needs pruning. That's a cold, specific kind of dread. And the film captures it efficiently in this single scene. What happens next is where Act 2 starts building real momentum, and where the film reveals its structural ambition by keeping 3 completely separate storylines in motion simultaneously, each one escalating on its own terms before they converge in the film's most devastating set piece. Strand 1, Apocalypse and Magneto at Auschwitz. This is the sequence that announces, unmistakably, that X-Men Apocalypse has not abandoned its franchise's core moral seriousness. That image, a little boy reaching through wire, his power awakening and screaming grief, is the moral anchor of everything that followed. It's why Magneto is sympathetic even at his most extreme. He learned what happens to people who are declared subhuman by those with power. He decided with entirely rational logic that he would never be on that side of the wire again. Bryan Singer brings Eric back to Auschwitz in Act 2, not as a prisoner, as something else entirely. Apocalypse wants to demonstrate something to his new horsemen, to show Eric the architecture of the world he's been trying to fit himself into and let him see it clearly. They walk through the ruins of the camp together. And Apocalypse doesn't make a speech about human evil or the justice of destruction, he just lets the place speak. The rusted gates, the empty barracks, the rails leading nowhere. Then he gives Eric back something that was taken from him as a child, his helmet. The one Magneto wears, reforged, improved. Michael Fassbender's reaction? The weight he gives to putting that helmet back on is one of the finest pieces of physical acting in the entire X-Men franchise. He doesn't smile. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks like a man putting down something he's been carrying for a very long time and realizing that setting it down feels exactly like picking it up again. Both are relief. Both are surrender. The difference is just which direction you're surrendering in. What follows is breathtaking in scale and horrifying in implication. Eric reaches out, his range now amplified to a planetary level by Apocalypse's enhancement, and pulls. The iron at the Earth's core responds. The magnetic poles destabilize. Metals everywhere begin moving, tearing themselves out of structures and vehicles and buildings. It's his version of prayer, this act. An offering to an ancient god made from the bones of the civilization that built Auschwitz. The visual effects here are extraordinary. We see skyscrapers across the globe beginning to fracture as their steel supports are pulled skyward, cars flipping, bridges groaning, the earth itself betraying its inhabitants the way their neighbors once did, and at the center of it all, standing on magnetized rubble rising into the air above what used to be the most terrible place on earth, is Eric Lehnsherr, finally, catastrophically free of every restraint he placed on himself. It's the kind of scene that reminds you this franchise has always been playing with real darkness. Whatever else X-Men Apocalypse does right or wrong, it earns this sequence completely. Strand 2, Quicksilver and the Mansion. While Eric is dismantling the planet's infrastructure, a very different kind of scene is unfolding in Westchester. Peter Maximoff, Quicksilver, played again by Evan Peters with the same chaotic, irresistible energy he brought to Days of Future Past, arrives at Xavier's school having tracked down the location after the events of the previous film. His reason for being there is personal in ways the film handles surprisingly well. He knows Eric Lyncher is his father. He hasn't told Eric. He came to Xavier's school, he tells himself, to maybe find a way to bridge that gap, to maybe finally have a family. Peter's Quicksilver is the film's comic relief in the best possible sense, meaning he's genuinely funny without undermining the weight of scenes around him. His introduction sequence at the school involves him ricocheting through several conversations at super speed, helping himself to the cafeteria, being somewhere he probably shouldn't be, and generally existing at a frequency that makes everyone around him seem like they're moving through mud. The young mutants love him immediately. The adults are cautiously wary, and then the mansion explodes. The bomb is planted by a resurrected or newly created. The film is wisely vague about this version of William Stryker's operation. The detonation tears through Xavier's school with no warning. Classrooms, the danger room, the lower laboratory levels where Cerebro lives. What happens next is the sequence that will outlast everything else in X-Men, Apocalypse, and the cultural memory of anyone who watches this film. The Quicksilver rescue. If the equivalent sequence in Days of Future Past, Quicksilver moving through the Pentagon kitchen in slow motion while Jim Croce's Time in a Bottle plays, was a proof of concept, this is the full thesis. The scale is incomparably larger. The entire mansion is in the process of exploding. Fire is filling corridors, walls are fragmenting, the structure is collapsing inward. And Peter moves through all of it at a speed where the destruction becomes something closer to abstract art. Frozen flames hanging in midair, debris suspended in three-dimensional shapes, a boy running through a moment that everyone else will experience as instantaneous death. The Eurythmics, Sweet Dreams Are Made of This, plays over the sequence, an extraordinary song choice that shouldn't work and absolutely does. There's something almost absurdist about the gap between the violence of the destruction and the cool, deliberate ease of Quicksilver moving through it, grabbing students, launching them toward safety, pausing to move a dog, stopping to eat a piece of pizza that got caught in mid-flight. He's having the time of his life. He was made for exactly this. And in that gap, between the horror of what's happening and the almost joyful ease with which he handles it, the film finds something genuinely moving. This is what powers are for. Not war, not ideology. Just this, one person moving fast enough to save everyone in the room. There's a brief shot, maybe 2 seconds, where Quicksilver's face, usually a study in studied nonchalance, shows something unguarded and focused. Total concentration. Zero humor. He's counting. He's keeping track. He will not leave anyone behind. Evan Peters doesn't say anything. He doesn't have to. And in that 2 seconds, the film turns its funniest character into its most heroic one. He almost gets everyone out. Almost. Havoc doesn't make it. Alex Summers, Scott's older brother, a founding member of the first-class team, a character who has been in the franchise for 2 films, dies in the explosion, not heroically in the climactic battle, not protecting someone. He dies triggering a failed device that was supposed to stop the bomb's detonation. The blast catches him full force and there's nothing left to save. The film handles this with restraint that verges on underplaying. Scott finds out from Mystique's expression rather than a dramatic announcement. Ty Sheridan does something gutting in this moment. Scott's face goes very still, the way grief hits sometimes when it's too large for an immediate reaction. He doesn't break down. He just goes quiet in a way that suggests something inside him has been permanently rearranged. It's a meaningful death in terms of franchise mechanics. It removes the older generation of first-class characters and forces the younger team into the foreground with no elder sibling to defer to. But it also works on a purely human level. Scott Summers has spent this entire film learning how to see the world, and the first major thing that happens when he opens his eyes properly is that he loses his brother. That's a brutal, specific kind of grief. And the film trusts the audience to sit with it rather than rushing to the next plot point. Meanwhile, the third strand of Act 2 lands its most crucial development. Charles Xavier is taken. Apocalypse arrives at the school, not in the explosion's aftermath, but during it, cutting through the chaos with his horsemen at his sides. His target was never the students. It was never the building. It was Cerebro and the mind that knows how to use it. Because Apocalypse, for all his ancient power, understands something fundamental about the modern world that his previous iterations missed: information network, communication infrastructure, the ability to speak to every human mind on the planet simultaneously. He needs Charles for exactly that. The abduction is staged as something genuinely cold and efficient. Apocalypse doesn't fight his way to Xavier. He walks, because nobody in that ruined mansion has anything capable of stopping him. He finds Charles standing in the smoke-filled ruins of the school he built, and there's a beat between them, just a few seconds, where McAvoy and Isaac share the screen, and the chemistry of that encounter is, honestly, one of the film's more underrated moments. Charles looks at this being with recognition, not just fear. He's already been inside that consciousness through Cerebro. He knows what Sabah is. And he's looking at him with something that approaches sorrow, the way you might look at someone who was once extraordinary and has been terribly, irreparably broken by time. Apocalypse doesn't register it. He takes Charles. And the world gets measurably darker. What follows immediately after the abduction moves through the film's messiest stretch, the capture of the surviving young X-Men by William Stryker's forces. This is where X-Men, Apocalypse's plotting gets its most mechanical, and it's worth being honest about that. Stryker's involvement feels less like a natural plot development and more like a franchise obligation, a way to justify the Weapon X sequence that everyone in the audience knows is coming the moment they see soldiers dragging mutant teenagers onto helicopters. Josh Helman's Stryker is adequate in the role, menacing enough, purposeful enough, but the character exists in Act 2 primarily as a delivery mechanism. Get the young X-Men to the facility. Get the young X-Men into danger. Create the circumstances under which a particular corridor in a particular underground laboratory gets drenched in something that doesn't wash out easily. You know what's coming. The film knows you know what's coming, and to its credit, it doesn't oversell the setup. It just gets there. The Weapon X sequence. There's no music when it starts. That's the first thing you notice. A cell door is opened. Someone is let out. And then there's just the sound of bone claws extending and the particular wet industrial noise of violence in a confined space. Wolverine. Weapon X. Post-experiment. Pre-everything that makes him human again. Hugh Jackman appears in costume. The full Weapon X gear, the containment harness, the eyes that are not quite Logan's eyes right now, and tears through a corridor of soldiers with a ferocity that earns its brief runtime completely. This isn't the cameo for nostalgia's sake, though it is that too. It's a reminder of something the X-Men films have always understood. Mutation without humanity is just violence. Logan in this state isn't a hero. He's a weapon that got loose. And the fact that he's cutting through men who probably deserved it doesn't make it any less disturbing to watch. Jean Grey reaches him. Not physically. She finds his mind in the chaos, reaches through the conditioning and the rage and the trauma, and finds something underneath it that is still Logan, still capable of being reached. She guides him back to himself, just enough. He looks at her. The killing machine focus softens by the smallest fraction, and then he's gone, running into the wilderness, not yet the man he'll become. Sophie Turner is extraordinary in this moment. She doesn't speak, she reaches, and watching her face while she does it, the effort, the tenderness, the slight shock of what she finds in that consciousness tells you everything about who Jean Grey is and why she matters. She's the only person in the corridor who didn't see a weapon. She saw a person, and she was right. The young X-Men escape. Mystique leads them. They have no plan and no resources, and their school is rubble, and their mentor is in the hands of an immortal god, mutant somewhere in the Egyptian desert. Act 2 ends on a specific note of controlled, almost formal despair. The camera finds these 5 young people, Scott, Jean, Kurt, Jubilee, Peter, in the back of a stolen vehicle moving through the night with no clear destination. They're not broken, they're not panicking, they're adjusting, processing, measuring the distance between where they were this morning and where they are now. Scott has lost his brother and his school in the same afternoon. Jean is holding herself very carefully because what she touched in Logan's mind left something behind. A crack in that wall Charles helped her build, a fissure she can feel but hasn't looked at directly yet. Kurt is praying. Peter is unusually still and quiet, which is somehow the most alarming thing of all. And Mystique, Raven, is up front, not quite a mentor, not quite an equal, trying to figure out if the legend people built around her can survive contact with the reality of what she actually is. Someone who is also scared, also uncertain, also building the plan one step at a time in real time. That's Act 2. The world cracked open, and these are the people left to close it. Cairo is the end of the world, or it's supposed to be. Apocalypse has chosen Egypt not randomly but deliberately, the place where civilization first organized itself around the idea of divine authority, where the first great human empires were built by people who believed a god walked among them. He's come full circle. He's home. And what he intends to build here, rising from the rubble of every military arsenal on the planet, is something that will make every previous human civilization look like a rough draft. The visual scale of what Bryan Singer and production designer Grant Major construct in Cairo is genuinely staggering. Apocalypse uses his power and Magneto's amplified range to pull metal and stone from across the city and raise a massive pyramid from the urban landscape itself. Buildings are disassembled, streets are torn upward, the Nile bends toward it. An entire neighborhood is consumed in the process, absorbed into this structure that is simultaneously a tomb, a throne room, and a broadcasting antenna, because that's what Apocalypse needs it for. He needs Charles strapped into a psychic amplification device of Apocalypse's own construction, one that dwarfs Cerebro in both scale and brutality, to transmit his voice into every human consciousness on the planet simultaneously. Not a message exactly, something more fundamental than language, a claim. An erasure of every national identity, every governing authority, every military command structure, replaced in a single broadcast moment with the simple, ancient fact of his existence and his dominion. He's done it before. Every few thousand years, the names change, the technology changes, the method is always the same. James McAvoy does something remarkable in the Cairo sequences that doesn't get discussed enough. Charles Xavier, for most of this film, has been defined by his belief, genuine, somewhat naive, costly in its consistency, that people are reachable, that the best of human and mutant nature is always available to be appealed to, if you just find the right frequency. It's what separates him from Eric, always has been. Inside Apocalypse's amplification device, that belief gets weaponized against him, because Apocalypse doesn't want Charles to resist. He wants Charles to transmit, and Charles, wired into a machine designed to project mutant consciousness across the globe, is fighting a battle that has no physical dimension at all. It's entirely internal, entirely psychic, entirely a question of whether the mind of one man, however extraordinary, can hold its own shape under the weight of a consciousness that has been accumulating force for thousands of years. McAvoy plays this in the series of fragmented broadcast sequences where Charles, speaking through the mouths of world leaders and newscasters and ordinary people, tries to insert something of himself into Apocalypse's transmission, not to fight it directly, that's impossible, but to contaminate it slightly, to slip something human into the broadcast alongside the divine proclamation, a plea, an acknowledgement. We're here, we're still here. It's understated in the way the best McAvoy moments always are. He's not giving a speech. He's whispering inside a shout, and the fact that it eventually works, that his voice reaches his students, reaches people he loves, reaches Raven in the Cairo streets below, says something specific about what the film believes. Not that hope overpowers fear, but that it survives alongside it if you're stubborn enough. Down in Cairo, the battle is extraordinary in the way that large-scale superhero action sequences can be when the geography is clearly established and the stakes are genuinely personal rather than abstractly civilizational. Mystique leads the assault, which is its own interesting choice. Raven has spent most of this film resisting the hero mythology that's built up around her. She doesn't feel like a symbol. She feels like a person who made a difficult decision once under extreme pressure and has been living in the aftermath ever since. The students at Xavier's school worship a version of her, blue-skinned, fierce, mythological, that she barely recognizes as herself. But here, in Cairo, with the world genuinely ending and the people she cares about in immediate danger, Raven stops negotiating with her own legend. She just fights. Jennifer Lawrence, who has been somewhat constrained in this film by a character arc that keeps Mystique in human form and keeps her emotionally at arm's length from the action, finally gets a stretch of the movie to inhabit fully. The Cairo battle is her sequence, as much as anyone else's. She's not the most powerful person in the fight. She's the most organized, the most purposeful. She's the one holding the plan together while everything around her is chaos. Scott Summers fights with his eyes open, literally, for the first time. The training he received at Xavier's school was brief. His control is imperfect. But there's a moment in the Cairo sequence where Cyclops unleashes a full optic blast at a structural element that Magneto has sent hurtling toward the group, and the beam hits its target, and Scott's face behind his visor shows pure, uncomplicated competence for the first time in his young life. Not relief this time, just capability. This is what his power is for. Not destruction, not accident. This. Ty Sheridan plays that realization quietly, the way he plays everything, inward rather than telegraphed. But it lands. This is the moment Scott Summers becomes Cyclops, not just a kid with dangerous eyes. And the film earns it because it spent 2 full acts showing us the cost of what those eyes have taken from him. Nightcrawler teleports, over and over and over. Through smoke, through falling debris, through the increasingly impossible geometry of a city being reconstructed in real time by a god and his metal-bending lieutenant. Cody Smith. McPhee is having the time of his life in this sequence, and the camera knows it. There are 3 or 4 shots of Kurt mid-teleport that exist purely as expressions of joy. Not triumphant, exactly. Just free. This boy who was kept in a cage and forced to fight for entertainment is now bouncing through the air over a destroyed Egyptian skyline at will, and the delight in his body language is almost unseemly given the circumstances. It works perfectly. It always works with Nightcrawler when the films get him right. Because his power is inherently joyful. the ability to be somewhere else in an instant, to escape any trap, to be untouchable. And the films that understand this use that joy as emotional counterweight to the darkness around it. Apocalypse understands it in Cairo. Kurt's aerial acrobatics are the film's way of reminding you, in the middle of the apocalypse, that flying is still wonderful. The Horsemen confrontations are staged with varying degrees of investment. Psylocke versus Beast is efficiently choreographed and utterly consequence-free. Both actors are working hard within the limitations of what they've been given, but there's no emotional history between these two characters to give the fight any weight beyond the visual. Olivia Munn's Psylocke looks incredible. The purple energy blade construct she fights with is one of the cleaner VFX designs in the film, but she's fighting as a concept rather than a person, and the movie hasn't given us any reason to care what happens to her beyond aesthetic appreciation. Angel is similar. His metal wings, a brutal reimagining of the character's original feathered flight, are grotesque in exactly the right way, a physical representation of what Apocalypse's amplification costs his horsemen beyond the tactical upgrade. He's been remade. The thing about Angel in the comics is that he's always been defined by the purity of his original mutation, the beauty of it, the gift of natural flight. Apocalypse took that and turned it into a weapon system. Ben Hardy communicates the tragedy of that transformation better than the screenplay gives him credit for, but the film doesn't linger on it long enough to let the theme breathe. Storm is different. Storm, in the Cairo battle, is a film unto herself, waiting to happen. Alexander's ship commands the sky with a ferocity that suggests what this character could be in a movie that had space for her, and her eventual switch. The moment she steps away from Apocalypse's side and back toward the X-Men is the film's most emotionally interesting Horseman moment, precisely because it's the least explained. No speech, no dramatic confrontation where her loyalty is debated. She just looks at what's happening around her, at what Apocalypse actually is, versus what she thought she was joining, and she moves. That's how real ideological breaks happen, not with argument, with evidence. Magneto's break comes differently, more slowly, more painfully. Here's what the film understands about Eric Lehnsherr, that most superhero narratives get wrong about their morally complex villains. His choices are never about ideology for its own sake. They're always about pain management. Eric doesn't follow Apocalypse because he believes in the survival of the fittest. He follows him because Apocalypse offered him the only thing that felt like an honest response to Nina and Magda's deaths. Permission to stop pretending it didn't matter. Permission to stop being Eric and go back to being Magneto. But in Cairo, at full destructive capacity, with the world literally coming apart at his hands, Eric Lehnsherr starts hearing Charles. Not the broadcast. The actual Charles, finding his way through the noise, finding the specific frequency that has always been theirs. And what Charles says to him isn't an argument. It's not ideological counterprogramming. It's just, I know what happened. I'm sorry. Come back anyway. That's the Xavier thesis in its purest form. Not you're wrong, but you're in pain, and I see it, and that doesn't mean it has to end here. Fassbender's response to this, the moment the rage breaks and something more complex floods in behind it, is the scene that Michael Fassbender will have on his highlight reel for this franchise long after specific plot details fade. He's still angry. He's still grieving. Both of those things remain completely true. But he looks at what his hands are doing to the world, and he makes a choice. Not the heroic choice, exactly. He doesn't switch sides and start fighting for the X-Men with enthusiasm. He just stops. And then he starts trying to undo some of what he broke. It's not redemption. It's not absolution. It's just a man deciding that the worst version of himself is not the only version. And in a franchise built on the tension between those two possibilities, that moment lands with the weight of 6 films of accumulated history behind it. Which brings us to Jean Grey and the Phoenix. Everything in X-Men Apocalypse has been, on some level, pointing here. The nightmare sequences that open Jean's storyline, fire in the shape of a bird, something enormous and barely contained thrashing against the inside of her skull, were not just character establishment, they were a promise, an inevitability being slowly, carefully set up over 90 minutes of film. When Apocalypse, his horseman neutralized, turns the full force of his power on the remaining X-Men, there's a moment where the fight is simply over. He's too powerful. He's been enhancing himself for thousands of years, absorbing abilities through countless bodies, and no combination of optic blasts and teleportation and Raven's resourcefulness is going to change that arithmetic. He takes Mystique and starts to crush her, using her as a demonstration, a statement about what disobedience costs. And Jean Grey, who has been holding herself together with both psychic hands this entire battle, who has been fighting with precise, controlled bursts of telekinesis while keeping that wall Charles built rigidly in place, just stops controlling, stops suppressing, stops managing. The wall comes down, What comes out of Jean Grey in the film's final 8 minutes is not anger or desperation. It's something more fundamental than emotion. It's more like a force of nature that has been trying to get out of a container that was always too small for it. The Phoenix Force, unnamed in this film but unmistakable to anyone who knows the mythology, manifests as fire shaped like wings, as shock waves of pure psychic energy that Apocalypse, for the first time, cannot simply absorb or redirect, because this isn't a mutation to be cataloged and added to his collection. This is something older than his oldest memory. Sophie Turner's performance in this sequence is almost entirely physical. Her face, her hands, the way she holds her body when the power is moving through her rather than being held back. She's not acting powerful, she's acting exposed, stripped down to something essential. The exhaustion is gone. The careful management is gone. And what's left is simultaneously terrifying and heartbreaking. A teenage girl finally letting herself be exactly what she is, and discovering that what she is cannot be contained by anyone, including herself. The visual effects team earns every dollar of their budget in this sequence. The Phoenix Fire is rendered with a warmth and an organic irregularity that makes it feel genuinely alive rather than CGI constructed. The wings are massive, asymmetrical, constantly reshaping themselves. Apocalypse, ancient, armored, the most powerful mutant who ever lived, is outmatched, not physically overpowered, philosophically contradicted. He built his entire worldview on the idea that power flows one direction, accumulates in one place, belongs to one being at a time. Jean Grey represents something that makes that idea incoherent. He simply ceases. The aftermath is quiet, deliberately, carefully quiet. Cairo is destroyed. The pyramid is rubble again. The X-Men stand in the wreckage, some injured, all exhausted, most of them processing the fact that they just survived something that nobody who has never seen a Saturday morning cartoon would have believed was survivable. Jean has pulled the Phoenix back inside herself, or tried to. The wall isn't rebuilt. It probably can never be fully rebuilt after that. She's standing in the middle of the destruction she caused, and her eyes are very wide and very frightened and very alive. Scott finds her. He doesn't ask her if she's okay. He just stands next to her, close enough that she knows someone is there. That's the relationship the film has been quietly building since they met at the school. Not a romance exactly, not yet, but an understanding. Two kids who are both scared of themselves, keeping each other company at the edge of what they might become. Charles approaches Jean last. He doesn't try to rebuild the wall. He doesn't tell her what she did was wrong or dangerous or needs to be managed differently next time. He just says, and this is the film's most important line, delivered without any cinematic weight, just one human being to another. You're not alone, Jean. It's simple. It's almost too simple. But it's the X-Men thesis in its shortest possible form, and McAvoy delivers it with a kind of quiet conviction that makes you believe he's been saying this specific sentence in different forms for his entire adult life. The film ends where it needed to end, not with Apocalypse's defeat as the emotional climax, with Jean Grey standing in Phoenix Fire discovering what she is, with Scott Summers opening his eyes in the morning light and choosing to keep them open, with Kurt Wagner somewhere new, somewhere chosen, wearing a uniform he actually wants to wear, with Storm stepping into the training room alongside people who didn't ask her to choose their side. She chose it herself. The new X-Men, assembled, not by destiny or prophecy or the will of an ancient god, by the particular and irreducible fact of their own survival. The old world ended. This is what grew in the wreckage. Characters are where movies live or die. Plot is architecture. It holds things up, provides shape, gives the story somewhere to go. But characters are the rooms you actually spend time in, the spaces that stay with you after you've left the building. X-Men. Apocalypse has more rooms than most superhero films, a sprawling ensemble spread across 3 generations of franchise history, each with their own psychological furniture and their own particular way of being in the world. Some of those rooms are fully realized, richly detailed, worth returning to. Some are beautifully decorated, but functionally empty. All of them are worth examining separately, because the distance between the film's best characterization and its most underdeveloped is one of the most instructive gaps in any blockbuster of this era. Let's start with the one that everything else rotates around. Michael Fassbender, Eric Lenschier, Magneto. Here is the central fact about Michael Fassbender's work in this franchise. He has never once been given a bad scene. He has been given scenes of wildly varying quality, scenes surrounded by sub-optimal material, scenes embedded in films that don't always know what to do with him. But Fassbender himself? Flawless. Every time. And in X-Men, Apocalypse, he delivers what is arguably the most complete performance in the entire Fox X-Men canon. What makes Fassbender's Magneto so extraordinary across all 3 prequel films, but especially here, is the precision of his psychological architecture. Eric Lenschier is not a simple character. He's a Holocaust survivor who became a freedom fighter, who became a terrorist, who tried to become a father. Each of those identities is authentic. Each of them costs him something. And Fassbender holds all of them simultaneously, never letting any single one fully eclipse the others, which is the only way to play a character this layered without collapsing into incoherence. In Apocalypse specifically, Fassbender is doing something extraordinarily technically demanding. He's playing a man in the process of dismantling the self he spent a decade building, the Polish factory worker, the husband, the father. These weren't masked, they were genuine. The film establishes this not through exposition, but through the specific quality of Eric's attention in domestic scenes. Watch how he listens to his wife. Watch how he moves when Nina is in the room. There's a looseness in his body that you never see when he's operating as Magneto, a physical openness that costs him real vigilance, and he pays it willingly, joyfully. Fassbender communicates a man who found something more important than his own survival, which is the most radical thing Eric Lehnsherr has ever done. And then the loss doesn't just take those people from him, it takes the evidence of that self, the proof that Eric Lehnsherr was capable of something other than controlled, purposeful destruction. That evidence is Nina, and when she's gone, Eric doesn't just grieve, he loses his argument. The internal debate he's been having with himself since First Class, the one Charles represents externally, the voice that says, "You are more than what was done to you," loses its most compelling witness. Fassbender doesn't play the grief as rage, which is the easier, more cinematic choice. He plays it as a kind of terrible clarification. Like a man who's squinted at something for years hoping it was something other than what it was, and has finally accepted the shape of it. His voice when he speaks to the police officers in the forest is not loud, it's very, very quiet. That quietness is more frightening than any amount of theatrical fury would be, because it suggests someone who has moved past the register where other people's reactions matter to him. Then he goes to Apocalypse, and the film makes a choice about this relationship that elevates what could have been simple villainy into something genuinely tragic. Apocalypse is not offering Eric ideology. He's offering him grief management, specifically the ancient, brutal grief management of someone who has watched enough history to know that the only way to stop feeling the loss of individuals is to invest entirely in abstractions, civilizations, epics, the long arc of species. Apocalypse lost his humanity. Whatever version of it a mutant born in 3600 BC possessed, so long ago that individual losses no longer register. He's offering Eric that same terrible gift, the elimination of attachment. Eric accepts, and watching Fassbender accept it is one of the most morally complex moments in the franchise, because you understand it completely. You don't endorse it, but you understand it. That's the mark of a performance operating at the highest level. What makes the Cairo pivot land is what came before it. By the time Charles finds Eric psychically in the middle of the destruction, reaching through the noise of a city coming apart to find the specific frequency of a 30-year friendship that has survived every possible strain, Fassbender has laid enough groundwork that the conflict visible on his face reads as genuine rather than convenient. This is not a man being talked out of villainy by a well-constructed argument. This is a man discovering that he isn't actually capable of becoming the thing he decided to become, that somewhere beneath the grief and the Auschwitz-forged certainty and the Apocalypse-granted permission, Eric Lehnsherr still has a self that objects. He doesn't become good, he becomes himself again. Which, with Eric, is complicated enough to be interesting. His final scene, floating above the ruins of Cairo, using his power to try to rebuild some of what he helped destroy, is quiet in a way that suits him perfectly. Not triumphant, not guilty, just present, doing the specific, small work that's available. Raven asks if he'll stay, join the school, be part of what comes next. He looks at the ruins. He says no. He leaves. That refusal is exactly right for this character. Eric Lehnsherr has never been able to stay anywhere. Not because he's inherently destructive, but because everywhere he tries to belong eventually gets taken from him, and at some point, the kindest thing he can do, for the place and for himself, is keep moving. Fassbender plays the exit with enormous dignity. No melodrama. Just a man walking away from a choice he's already made and will have to keep making every day. 3 films in, Michael Fassbender's Magneto remains the best villain characterization in the superhero genre. Not because he's evil, because he isn't, quite. James McAvoy. Charles Xavier. Charles Xavier, in the context of the prequel trilogy, is one of the most interesting characters in superhero cinema, not because of what he can do, but because of the specific texture of his flaws. McAvoy's Xavier is idealistic in a way that is sometimes indistinguishable from arrogance. He believes in people with such genuine conviction that he occasionally mistakes his belief for knowledge, as though wanting something to be true strongly enough could substitute for evidence. Apocalypse is particularly clear-eyed about this. The Moira McTaggart subplot, specifically the moment when Charles, accessing her memories through Cerebro to gather intelligence, inadvertently overwrites her recollection of their relationship, is not staged as a dramatic confrontation. It's handled almost in passing, which makes it worse. Charles didn't intend to violate her memory. He was careless with it. And the film doesn't let him off the hook for that carelessness simply because his intentions were good. That's new territory for this franchise. The earlier films were protective of Xavier's moral authority in ways that sometimes prevented honest examination of what it means to have the ability to access and rewrite human minds. Apocalypse opens a crack in that protection. Not wide enough to fully interrogate Charles's ethics. That would be a different, more provocative film, but wide enough to let some uncomfortable light through. McAvoy's great achievement across the prequel trilogy is making Charles's optimism feel earned rather than naive. This is not a man who believes in people because he's never seen the worst of them. This is a man who has seen the worst and chooses, daily, as an act of will rather than innocence, to lead with the best. In Apocalypse, that will is tested at the cellular level, when Apocalypse wires him into the amplification device and tries to use his capacity for connection as a weapon. And what Charles does inside that machine, the tiny, stubborn act of inserting his own voice into the broadcast, of refusing to let the transmission be purely Apocalypse's, is the bravest thing in the film precisely because it requires no physical courage whatsoever. It's just a man refusing to stop being himself under pressure to stop being himself. By the film's end, Charles has lost his hair. The physical transformation into the Professor X we know from the original films is complete. The radiation from the amplification device having done what nothing else managed to do, and he's standing at the head of a training room full of young mutants. McAvoy plays the final scene with a forward-looking quality that's slightly different from the hopefulness earlier in the film. This isn't the same idealism. It's been through something. It knows more about the cost now, but it's still there, still functioning, still inviting people in. That's what Charles Xavier is. Not a saint, not infallible, just someone who keeps showing up with the door open. Oscar. Is AAC. En. Sabah a Nur. Apocalypse. Let's be honest. And precise. Because Oscar Isaac deserves honesty and precision more than he deserves either pure defense or dismissal. Isaac is one of the finest actors working anywhere. His performance in Ex Machina the previous year was one of the most controlled and terrifying pieces of screen acting in recent memory. In Inside Llewyn Davis, in A Most Violent Year, he has demonstrated repeatedly the capacity to inhabit characters of enormous complexity with minimal apparent effort. The man can do anything. What happened in X-Men Apocalypse is not a failure of acting. It's a failure of collaboration between performance and production choices that made certain aspects of the performance inaccessible. Start with the physical. Apocalypse's costume and prosthetic design, the gray-purple skin, the armor that bulk him up to roughly twice Isaac's natural silhouette, the layered headpiece, was controversial before the film opened and remains divisive. The design is attempting to literalize the character's comic book appearance, which involves heavy, ornate Egyptian-influenced armor and a physically massive frame. Isaac is not physically massive. He's lean and precise in his movements, and his expressiveness as a performer lives primarily in his eyes and the subtle micro-adjustments of his face. The prosthetics cover most of that face. The bulk of the costume works against his natural movement vocabulary. The result is a performance that is being delivered from behind a wall of production design decisions. Isaac does what he can. The voice, low, resonant, projected from somewhere deeper than normal speech, is his own invention, and it works. There are moments where his eyes, the only part of him fully visible, do tremendous work. The sequence where Apocalypse walks through a Cairo market absorbing centuries of history has a genuine weight to it. Isaac carries the exhaustion and cold recognition of someone who has seen this before and isn't surprised by any of it. The scene where he finds Storm and asks what she wants, watching her face with the careful attention of someone who has been reading people for millennia, is quietly compelling. But the screenplay is also working against him in ways the prosthetics can't be blamed for. Apocalypse gets very few scenes of genuine psychological intimacy, very few moments where we understand what he wants beyond the abstract, cleanse the world. Objective. The best villains want something specific, something that could conceivably be satisfied, even if the method of satisfying it is monstrous. Thanos wanted peace. Magneto wants safety. Killmonger wants justice. What does Apocalypse want? The film's answer: to be worshipped, to have the strong rule, is philosophically coherent but emotionally inert. There's no personal stake, no specific wound beneath the cosmic ambition. This is the crucial absence. Without it, Apocalypse remains a concept rather than a character. And concepts, no matter how powerfully designed and competently performed, don't generate the specific kind of dread that great villains generate. You fear what Apocalypse can do. You don't fear Apocalypse, and those are completely different experiences. Isaac has spoken publicly about his frustration with the experience of making this film, the isolation of the costume, the difficulty of connecting with scene partners through layers of latex. That frustration is visible in his performance, if you know to look for it. A slight disconnection between the character's stated power and the physical grounding of the performance, a sense of someone working hard to find purchase on material that keeps slipping. He finds it in moments. He can't sustain it across a 2.5-hour film under those conditions. The waste of Oscar Isaac in this role is not a tragedy of talent, but of creative alignment. The right version of this character, intimately designed, physically accessible, written with personal stakes that connect to the thematic arguments of the film, would have been extraordinary. What we got was one of cinema's most gifted performers doing admirable work in conditions specifically designed to make admirable work insufficient. Sophie Turner. G-E-N-G. Turretly, playing a character who is simultaneously a frightened teenager and the most powerful being in the X-Men universe. That's an impossible brief. The fact that she pulls it off, not perfectly, not every moment, but in the ways that matter, is genuinely impressive. What Turner does well is granular. It's in the details. The way Jean holds her coffee cup in both hands at breakfast, like she needs the warmth of it as an anchor. The way she positions herself at the back of group spaces, angled slightly away from the crowd, giving herself the maximum possible buffer from the noise of other people's minds. The way she talks, slightly faster than necessary, slightly more precisely than casual conversation requires, like someone who has learned to communicate efficiently because extended interactions are genuinely exhausting at her volume level. These are all choices. Small, consistent, invisible. If you're not looking, choices that accumulate into a portrait of someone living with a sensory processing challenge that no human language was built to describe. Turner doesn't play Jean as tragic or mysterious or prophetically significant. She plays her as functional, getting through the day, managing, which is exactly the right choice because it makes the Phoenix sequence feel like the release of real, specifically established pressure rather than a dramatic CGI event. The scene that does the most work for this character, and it's not a scene that gets discussed enough, is Jean's nightmare sequence early in the film. She wakes up in her room in the school, the fire and bird imagery dissipating as she surfaces into consciousness, and she lies there for a long moment just breathing. Turner's face in that moment shows something that isn't fear and isn't pain and isn't quite resignation. It's the specific expression of someone who has had this nightmare before, many times before, who has stopped expecting the nightmares to stop and has simply incorporated them into the texture of existing. That moment seeds everything that comes later. The Phoenix isn't a threat Jean is unaware of. It's a threat she is exquisitely, exhaustingly aware of, has been managing for years, and has built her entire daily psychology around containing. When the containment finally fails in Cairo, the emotional register isn't something unexpected is happening. It's closer to something I always knew was coming, has arrived. Turner plays it with open eyes and a stillness that reads as the opposite of surrender. It reads as recognition. Her relationship with Scott is the film's most underrated emotional thread. They meet as two people who are both, in different ways, afraid of their own eyes. Scott, because his open uncontrolled. Jean, because hers see too much. Their first conversation has the specific awkwardness of two people who recognize something in each other that they can't quite articulate. Turner and Sheridan play it without nudging toward romance, which is the right call. What develops between them in this film is something prior to romance, something more like kinship, the recognition of a particular kind of loneliness. T.Y.E. Sheridan. Scott Summers, C.Y. Klopp. Scott Summers is, historically, one of the most difficult X-Men to translate to screen. The character's defining qualities, discipline, tactical intelligence, a kind of uptight moral seriousness, read as stiff in the wrong hands, and the original film series sidelined him almost entirely in favor of Wolverine's more cinematically accessible wildness. Sheridan's approach to Scott is the most successful screen version of the character because it finds the wound beneath the discipline. This Scott isn't uptight because he's naturally rigid. He's rigid because he's learned, through specific, documented experience, that relaxing his control has consequences that hurt other people. His defensiveness isn't attitude, it's protocol. And once you understand that, every prickly exchange he has in the film's first act reads differently, not as arrogance, but as someone keeping a very careful distance from situations where things might go wrong. The ruby quartz glasses are the film's most efficient piece of character design. They're simultaneously a solution and a symbol, the technology that makes Scott functional in the world, that allows him to see without destroying. His reluctance to wear them, the period before Hank fits him with a proper pair when his eyes are taped shut, is a period of genuine helplessness for a character whose entire psychology is built around control. Sheridan plays that helplessness without making it pathetic. He plays it as a temporary state being endured with as much dignity as possible, which, again, is exactly Scott. By the end of the film, standing in the ruins of Cairo with a new visor and a new team, Scott Summers is not yet a leader. He's not yet the tactician and field commander he'll become. But Sheridan suggests the potential of that person, the particular quality of attention, the instinct to assess situations rather than react to them, without forcing it. It's a slow burn of characterization, and it's one of the most patient pieces of character work in the film. Jennifer Lawrence. Raven and Mystique, Jennifer Lawrence was, by 2016, the most famous actress in the world. She had won an Academy Award. She had anchored the Hunger Games franchise through 4 films. She was also, by most visible accounts, somewhat exhausted by the obligations of franchise filmmaking. The choice to keep Raven primarily in human form, rather than Mystique's blue-skinned appearance, a choice driven partly by Lawrence's preference and partly by the practical realities of full-body makeup requiring hours of daily application, is the most visually significant concession the film makes to its star's comfort, and it matters thematically. Not as a criticism of Lawrence's commitment, but as an interesting reading of the character. Raven, keeping her human face in this film, mirrors her psychological state. She's been moving through the world as a human activist rather than a mutant symbol, deliberately occupying the borderland between the two identities, uncomfortable with the mythology that has grown around her blue skin. Lawrence plays this discomfort genuinely. The scenes where young mutants respond to her with awe, where Nightcrawler and Jubilee treat her like a revolutionary icon, are played with a wincing quality that communicates exactly the right thing, that Raven knows the gap between the legend and the reality better than anyone, and finds the gap mortifying rather than flattering. She didn't ask to be a symbol. She made a desperate choice in a desperate moment, and the world turned it into a poster. Her arc in Apocalypse is quieter than her previous appearances in the franchise, which suits the character but somewhat disappoints the audience. The film has her coming around to a more active heroism, accepting, finally, the symbol rather than continuing to reject it. But the journey is compressed in ways that make the arrival feel slightly unearned. When she stands in the training room at the film's end, effectively stepping into the role of field commander and mentor, the emotional preparation for that moment doesn't quite match the significance the film assigns it. Lawrence is good in the role throughout. She's just working with a version of the character that the film hasn't fully committed to. KOD, SMIT, McPhee, Kurt, Wagner, Nightcrawler. No character in X-Men, Apocalypse is more purely themselves, more consistently realized, or more genuinely joyful to watch than Kurt Wagner. Smith-McPhee found something in Nightcrawler that previous portrayals, including Alan Cummings' effective but darker take in X2, hadn't fully articulated. The character's faith is not in spite of his appearance, but because of what his appearance has taught him about the relationship between surface and soul. Kurt looks like a demon. He is, by every evidence the film provides, one of the kindest people in it. He's made peace with that contradiction not through bitterness or defiant irony, but through genuine theological acceptance. If God made him this way, then what he is must be what God needed him to be. That's a genuinely complex religious character in a genre that almost never does religious characters with any sophistication, and Smith-McPhee carries it lightly without ever making Kurt feel like a walking theology lesson. The faith shows up in small moments, a casual reference to prayer, a genuine curiosity about what other people believe, a willingness to extend trust to strangers that isn't naivety but a principled refusal to prejudge. His first scene with Jean at the X-Mansion is the film's most purely warm exchange. Two people who have never met, one of whom looks extremely alarming, sharing a moment of recognition so straightforward and unguarded that it almost feels like it belongs in a gentler film. Jean sees Kurt without flinching. Kurt meets Jean without the defensive posturing of someone accustomed to being feared. They just talk, like people. It's lovely and easy, and it does more work for both characters' emotional credibility than any action sequence could. Smith-McPhee also has terrific physical comedy instincts that the film uses well. There's a sequence at the mall, a brief, lighter interlude that the film uses to let its young cast simply exist together before the apocalyptic third act, where Kurt's delight at The Empire Strikes Back is played with such genuine, infectious enthusiasm that the cinema audience invariably laughs, not at him, but with him. The joke isn't weird mutant kid encountering normal human entertainment. The joke is person encountering great art for the first time, which is a much sweeter, more inclusive thing. Ivan, Peters, Peter, Maximoff, Quicksilver. Quicksilver had the breakout sequence of Days of Future Past. In Apocalypse, he has the even more spectacular mansion rescue and a secondary emotional arc that the film handles better than it's usually given credit for. Peter knows Eric Lencher is his father. He's known for a while. He came to the school partly to find a way to say it. The film tracks this across several scenes, a wistfulness in Peter's eyes whenever Eric is mentioned, a specific quality of attention when the subject comes up that differs from his otherwise relentlessly ironic engagement with everything around him. Peters plays it as a background hum of unfinished business rather than a foregrounded dramatic arc, which is the right call. Peter hasn't worked out what he wants from this potential acknowledgement, so he can't act on it with any conviction. He could just keep it alive and see. The near miss in Cairo, where Peter approaches Eric, where the confession almost happens and then doesn't, where the moment passes and both men move back into the immediate crisis, is one of the film's more quietly sad sequences. Not because the revelation would have changed anything practical, but because Peter, for all his speed, couldn't find a way to close that particular distance. And Eric, who lost one child to the indifference of a world that feared him, doesn't know there's another one standing right there. Peters plays the not telling with a light touch that keeps it from becoming melodrama. It's just a thing Peter carries, one more item in the collection of things that run at full speed beneath his studied casualness. Nicholas Hoult, Hank McCoy Beast, Holt's Beast, is the franchise's most consistent supporting presence. Competent, warm, occasionally given more to do than expected, never given quite enough to achieve the prominence his performance deserves. In Apocalypse, Hank exists primarily in a support function, maintaining the school, fitting Scott with glasses, providing tactical context, fighting Psylocke in Cairo with more physicality than the screenplay gives him, emotional material to match. What Hoult does consistently well is the specific loneliness of being both brilliant and monstrous, a scientist who is also a creature, someone whose transformation from book-smart, beautiful young man to blue furry beast represents a fundamental break with the social world his intelligence was supposed to give him access to. There's a wry self-awareness in Hoult's performance that the films never quite capitalize on. Hank McCoy, fully examined, is one of the most interesting characters in the X-Men universe. Apocalypse knows this and keeps not quite finding the time to do anything about it. It's the franchise's persistent sin with him. But Hoult shows up for every scene he's in with full investment, which is all you can ask. The ensemble as a unit. Something worth noting about the young cast, Sheridan, Turner, Smith, McPhee, Shipp, Peters, is how naturally they function together once the film gets all of them in the same space. There's an organic ensemble chemistry that the film's structure sometimes works against by keeping them separated across parallel storylines for long stretches. But when they're finally together, in the Stryker facility, then in the stolen vehicle moving through the night, then in Cairo, there's an ease between them that suggests a genuine repertory company having genuine fun with each other. That matters more than it sounds. Superhero ensemble chemistry is frequently manufactured through dialogue and plot mechanics. Characters deliver quips at each other, demonstrate compatible power sets, share a common enemy. What this group has is something more fundamental, a sense that these people recognize each other's particular varieties of difficulty and have decided to be useful rather than distant about it. It feels less like a superhero team and more like a friend group that happens to be extraordinary, which is, at its best, exactly what the X-Men are supposed to feel like. The passing of the torch at the film's end, when Charles looks at these 5 young people standing in their new uniforms in the training room, works not just as franchise mechanics, but as emotional conclusion, because we've watched these specific individuals find each other over the course of 104 minutes. They didn't become a team because the plot required it. They became a team because they were all, in their different ways, looking for somewhere to belong. Xavier's school has always offered that. Now, with a new generation at its core, it's offering it again. There's a version of film criticism that treats technical craft as a separate conversation from everything else, a box to check after you've discussed story and character, something you address briefly before moving on to themes. That version of criticism does a disservice to movies like X-Men, Apocalypse, where the technical decisions are not decorative additions to the story but active arguments about the story, where the way something is shot is inseparable from what that something means. This film was made by craftspeople at the absolute peak of their technical capability. Some of those capabilities were deployed with genuine vision. Some were pointed in directions that didn't serve the material. All of it is worth examining specifically, not just whether it looks good or sounds impressive, but what choices were made, why, and what those choices do to your experience of watching. Let's start with the camera. Newton Thomas, Sigil, Cinematography. Newton Thomas Sigil has been Bryan Singer's primary cinematographer since The Usual Suspects in 1995. That's over 2 decades of visual collaboration, a working relationship long enough to develop a shared grammar, a set of shared intuitions about where the camera should be, how it should move, what it should withhold. By X-Men Apocalypse, they are operating from a place of deep mutual understanding, and that deep understanding produces some of the film's most accomplished images. The single most compositionally striking sequence Sigil photographs in Apocalypse isn't the Cairo skyline destruction or the Phoenix eruption. It's the Auschwitz scene. And the reason it works so well cinematically comes down to one deliberate, costly choice: restraint. Sigil shoots Auschwitz with almost no movement. The camera is mostly static, positioned at ground level or slight elevation, and it refuses the kind of sweeping grandeur that location photography often defaults to when trying to communicate enormity. What that stillness does, what static photography at this specific location does, is make the space feel inhabited by its own history, like the emptiness isn't empty at all. Like what happened there left something in the air that the camera can't quite show directly, but can position itself to acknowledge. Eric and Apocalypse walk through this space, and Sigil keeps them small within it. Not dwarfed by visual spectacle, dwarfed by implication. The frame is wide and the two figures are relatively uncentered, and what fills the rest of the image is just ground. Rusted infrastructure, the horizon, space that used to be occupied by people who aren't there anymore. It's one of the most morally serious pieces of cinematography in any superhero film, and it works precisely because it refuses to beautify anything. Contrast that with the way Sigil shoots Apocalypse's first appearance in modern Cairo, handheld, slightly loose, at street level, following the ancient mutant through a contemporary market. The handheld quality here is not the frantic, combat documentary style that action films use to generate adrenaline. It's more anthropological, like a documentary camera following an unusual subject through an unusual environment. Which is, of course, exactly the right frame for a being who is experiencing the modern world as a curious artifact of epochs he remembers differently. The camera's slight instability mirrors Apocalypse's cognitive state. Everything is familiar in structure, strange in detail, requiring constant reorientation. The Egypt prologue uses a very different visual register again, locked-off wides, high angles that emphasize the geometry of the ritual space, a color palette saturated with gold and amber that makes the whole sequence feel like memory rather than present-tense narrative. Sigil and Singer are establishing early that this story lives in multiple temporal registers simultaneously, and the cinematography enforces that distinction. When we're in the past, the light is warm and excessive, almost overexposed, the way very old memories tend to be, too bright, slightly unreal. When we're in 1983, the palette cools. The light is more accurate, more contemporary. The visual temperature drops as the story gets closer to the present, which is a subtle but consistent cue that rewards attention. Where the cinematography is less successful, and this is worth saying plainly, is in certain stretches of the Cairo battle sequence, particularly the extended portions involving multiple horsemen and VFX elements simultaneously. Sigil is an exceptional photographer of faces and architecture. He is somewhat less comfortable with pure kinetic chaos. And when the Cairo sequence requires him to photograph 6 or 7 characters in enhanced combat across a partially destroyed urban environment, the geography occasionally becomes murky. There are shots where you're aware that something impressive is happening, but can't quite parse the spatial relationships between the people doing impressive things. This is partly a VFX integration issue. More on that shortly. But the composition choices in combat don't always give you the spatial anchoring that the best action cinematography provides. The X2 mansion attack, for comparison, is constantly clear about where everyone is relative to everyone else. Parts of the Cairo battle are not. That's not a fatal flaw. It's a technical limitation visible mostly to people who are actively looking for it. But it's there. John Ottman, score and editing. John Ottman has one of the most unusual credit combinations in studio filmmaking. He is both the composer and the editor of most of Bryan Singer's films. This creates an integration between music and cutting rhythm that most films simply cannot achieve, because most films involve 2 different people who collaborate after the fact. Ottman builds the score knowing exactly where the cuts are. He designs the cuts knowing exactly what the score will do. The result, at its best, is a film where music and editing are not synchronized but genuinely fused. In X-Men Apocalypse, that fusion produces some genuinely remarkable sequences, and one sequence that is almost certainly the most technically accomplished thing in the film. Start with the score itself. Ottman composes across multiple distinct thematic registers in this film, each one calibrated to a different strand of the story. There's a theme for Apocalypse that is ancient and modal, built on intervals that don't quite resolve in the ways Western tonal harmony trains you to expect, creating a persistent feeling of incompleteness, of something vast that never quite settles. There's a theme for Magneto that carries forward motifs from the previous prequel films, transforming them slightly in this entry. The strings are heavier, slower, more weighted. The heroic quality that occasionally broke through in First Class is largely absent here. What's left is the gravity of someone carrying something very heavy for a very long time. The young X-Men get a theme that is deliberately lighter in orchestration, woodwinds, and a brighter string register that functions almost as a promise. It hasn't fully developed yet. It doesn't need to. It's a theme that's still becoming itself, the musical equivalent of teenagers who don't know yet what they'll grow into. By the film's final sequence, when the new team stands in the training room, that theme expands. Ottman lets it open up. Not triumphantly, this isn't a fanfare. More like a deep breath. More like something that has been waiting for the right moment to take its full shape. The editing across the film's first two acts is precisely calibrated to manage the problem of running three parallel storylines simultaneously without losing emotional momentum in any of them. Ottman's cross-cutting between Poland, Cairo, and Westchester in the film's setup follows a rhythm that gives each strand just long enough to breathe and build before transitioning, using the emotional register of each scene to create contrast rather than interruption. When you cut from the warmth of Eric's domestic scenes to the ancient cold of Apocalypse's Cairo emergence, the tonal shift does work that dialogue doesn't have to do. You feel the temperature change. That's editing as emotional argument. The Quicksilver rescue sequence deserves its own analysis in terms of editing structure, because it's technically more complex than it appears. The illusion of Quicksilver's superspeed is not created purely by slowing the camera frame rate. It's constructed in the editing suite through a series of interlocking choices about which moments to hold, which to skip, and how to use the slight imperfection of frozen physics to generate comedy and wonder simultaneously. There are 17 distinct visual gags embedded in that sequence, each one requiring precise timing. The pizza, the dog, the swimming pool displacement effect, the teacher caught mid-fall with his toupee separating from his head. Each of these gags has a setup, a beat, and a release, and they're woven through the larger rescue action without ever interrupting its momentum. That's surgical editing. Ottman knows exactly how long each gag can breathe before the sequence starts to feel indulgent, and he cuts to the frame, where the editing is more uneven. Again, worth saying honestly, is in the film's second act, specifically the transition between the mansion explosion and the Stryker facility capture. The pacing here accelerates beyond what the emotional material can sustain. The death of Havoc, the capture of the young X-Men, and the Weapon X setup are compressed into a stretch that moves so quickly, the audience doesn't have adequate space to process any individual development before the next one arrives. Ottman and Singer are clearly trying to maintain momentum after the mansion sequence, worried about losing the energy they've built. But the compression costs the Havoc death scene most of its impact. A scene that in a slower cut could have been genuinely devastating is reduced to something the film passes through rather than stopping for. It's the most visible structural regret in the editing, and it slightly undermines what is otherwise one of the more precisely constructed blockbusters of its era. Visual. Fart spans an enormous range, from an enormous range to Glover's Tauter's powers to Glover's cars to Glover's to Glurs to Glover Munder structure to Tarzwaner constructed. Understanding where the VFX budget was spent most effectively and where it was stretched thin tells you a lot about the film's production priorities. The single best VFX sequence in the film, and among the best in the entire franchise, is the magnetic pole's disruption, where Magneto pulls metal from across the globe simultaneously. The effect here is not just technically accomplished, it's physically convincing in the specific way that the best VFX achieves. The movement of metal through the sequence doesn't behave like CGI. It behaves like an actual material with actual weight being acted upon by an actual force. The steel beams tearing out of buildings have a lag to their initial movement, a fraction of a second of resistance before the magnetic force overcomes their anchoring. That correctly matches real material physics. The VFX team clearly referenced actual footage of structural steel under stress to get that resistance right, and that reference work elevates the effect from spectacle to something more visceral. The raised pyramid in Cairo is a more mixed achievement. The structure itself is impressively designed. Grant Major's production design team clearly developed the architecture in detail before handing it to the VFX pipeline, and the result is a building that has internal logic rather than just aesthetic ambition. But the integration of the practical Cairo street-level photography with the digital environment above it is inconsistent. There are shots in the Cairo battle where the digital sky and upper environment feel like they exist in a slightly different film than the human-scale action happening below them. The color grading tries to bridge this. Sigel's team worked to unify the practical and digital photography in post, but the seam is occasionally visible in the way that digital skies tend to have a cleanliness that practical environments resist. The Phoenix effects are where the VFX team deserves the most specific credit. The fire in the Phoenix sequence is rendered using a fluid simulation approach rather than the particle-based fire that was standard practice at the time, and the difference is immediately apparent. Particle fire tends to look granular, individual elements visible at the edges. Fluid simulated fire behaves more like an actual continuous substance, with the internal turbulence and self-referencing movement of real combustion. Add to that a color palette that ranges from deep orange-red at the core to almost white at the outer edges, accurately modeling how fire actually looks at different temperature gradients. And the result is fire that reads as genuinely alive rather than rendered. That aliveness is crucial for the sequence's emotional impact. Jean isn't just surrounded by CGI. She's surrounded by something that looks like it has its own intention. The Horseman power effects are competently executed, but somewhat generic. The exception being Storm's lightning work, which uses a practical electrical element as reference and achieves a crackling, irregular quality that distinguishes it from the smooth, too-perfect digital lightning that superhero films often default to. Psylocke's telekinetic blade is clean and well-designed. Angel's metal wings have a satisfying weight to their movement. Neither has the specificity of the best effects work in the film. One underappreciated VFX contribution is the cerebro visualization. The sequence where Charles reaches into Apocalypse's consciousness is rendered as a series of fragmenting spatial environments, locations that are simultaneously Egypt and the school, and somewhere outside of geography entirely. The psychic space is visualized using a fractal architecture that breaks apart as Apocalypse's consciousness pushes back against Charles's intrusion. It's a specific, thoughtful design choice, representing psychic power as architectural fragmentation rather than the usual visual noise, and it captures something true about what it might feel like to have your sense of spatial reality dismantled by an outside force. Production Design. Grant Major and the World of 1983. Grant Major, production designer for the Lord of the Rings trilogy among other landmark films, brings an architect's sensibility to X-Men, Apocalypse. His most important contribution is something you probably felt rather than consciously registered. The Xavier Institute, for the first time in this franchise, feels like a place that would actually work. Previous films set in the school, including the original 2000 film and several of its sequels, treated the mansion primarily as an aesthetic backdrop. Beautiful, yes. Expensive looking, absolutely, but staged rather than inhabited. Major's version of the school in 1983 has the specific clutter of a place where people live and work and learn. Classrooms have the accumulated material evidence of ongoing courses, books left on desks, diagrams on boards that weren't erased between shoots, students' personal objects visible in the background of wide shots. The hallways have the particular organized chaos of an institution that has more students than it was originally designed for. Bedrooms have personal touches. Labs have the productive disorder of actual scientific work. The school's ongoing construction, the danger room isn't finished, certain wings are still being fitted out, is a quietly significant design choice. This is an institution still figuring out what it wants to be, physically manifesting the thematic work of the film. A school in the middle of becoming itself, for students who are in the middle of becoming themselves. The contrast with Apocalypse's pyramid is absolute and deliberate. Where the school has organic imperfection, the pyramid has geometric totality. Every line in its interior resolves to a vanishing point. Every space is calculated to make the human occupant feel small relative to the architecture. Major is designing two opposing philosophies in built form. The school says, you are more than what contains you. The pyramid says, you are contained, and your container is permanent. The 1983 period design throughout the film, the cars, the technology, the clothes, the interior, is handled with a light touch that avoids costume drama. Nostalgia. This is 1983 as a functional time period rather than 1983 as an aesthetic choice. The Cold War context registers primarily through television news broadcasts and a general geopolitical unease in the background of scenes, not through self-conscious period detail. The result is a version of the past that feels like a version of the present where things are slightly different, which is exactly the right register for a film about whether the mistakes of history are truly available for correction. Sound design. The spaces between the music. The sound design in X-Men, Apocalypse works in two fundamentally different modes, and understanding the difference between them reveals a lot about what the film does well. Mode 1. The immersive, overpowering sound design of large-scale action. Cairo, under Apocalypse's transformation, is a genuinely overwhelming sonic environment. The deep subsonic rumble of buildings being structurally compromised, the higher frequency screaming of torn metal, the irregular percussion of falling debris, layered over Ottman's score in a way that pushes into physical territory. You feel this in your chest in a properly equipped cinema. That's intentional. The sound team used multiple layers of sub-bass frequencies that bypass cognitive processing and register directly as physical sensation, a technique that, when used correctly, turns spectacle into something closer to experience. Mode 2, deliberate, purposeful silence. And this is where the sound design becomes genuinely artful. The scene where Eric levitates that police badge, already mentioned for its visual and performance elements, worth revisiting for what the sound team does with it, strips the audio landscape down to almost nothing. The score vanishes. The ambient sound of the forest fades. What's left is the specific, thin, high-frequency sound of a small metal disc moving through air at speed. The sound team apparently recorded dozens of different small metal objects moving through air at different velocities and combined 3 recordings to achieve the particular texture of that badge in motion, sharp enough to be clearly metallic, small enough to feel precise, fast enough to feel inevitable. That sound does something extraordinary in context, because you've spent 15 minutes in this forest scene hearing warmth, birds, wind, Nina's voice, the ordinary acoustic texture of domestic happiness. And then the badge kills that texture in an instant and fills the vacuum with this thin, precise, terrible sound. The contrast is the point. The silence that follows it is the point. Grief has a sound design. In this scene, it sounds like nothing at all. The Cerebro sequences use a different silence, not the absence of sound, but the suspension of it. Charles on Cerebro has always been associated with a particular acoustic treatment, a slight reverb on his voice, a sense of space expanding. In Apocalypse, when he makes contact with the ancient consciousness in Egypt, that expansion goes wrong. The reverb distorts. The space becomes uncomfortable. The sound designers used pitch shifting on the ambient Cerebro audio to drop it by a tritone, an interval that Western ears have been conditioned over centuries to associate with unease, the so-called diabolus in musica, and the effect is subtle enough to register subconsciously rather than consciously. You feel that something is wrong before you fully understand what's happening. Jean Grey's scenes at the school use almost no musical underscoring. This is a deliberate choice that the music editor maintains consistently across her early appearances. When Jean is managing her abilities at the school, trying to function within normal human acoustic parameters while her mind operates on a planetary scale, the soundtrack refuses to romanticize that effort. No swelling strings, no wistful piano motif. Just the ordinary sounds of a school, slightly too loud, the way everything is slightly too loud for someone whose sensory processing is permanently overwhelmed. Sound design is empathy. Sound design that asks you to feel the texture of Jean's daily experience rather than just observe it. When you step back and look at the technical craft of X-Men, Apocalypse as a whole, across cinematography, score, editing, VFX, production design, and sound, what emerges is a picture of a film that is technically more sophisticated than its reputation suggests, while also being genuinely uneven in its deployment of that sophistication. The film knows exactly what it's doing in its best sequences. The Auschwitz photography, the Magneto pole disruption, the Phoenix fluid simulation, the school's inhabited architecture, the badge's sound design. These aren't happy accidents. They're the result of experienced, talented craftspeople working with clear intentions and sufficient resources. What occasionally undermines that craft is something harder to pin on any single department, a tendency, most visible in the action, heavy second act, to rely on technical accomplishment as a substitute for emotional specificity. When you're not sure what a scene is feeling, make it larger. When the stakes feel abstract, make them visible through VFX. This is the occupational hazard of franchise blockbuster filmmaking. The tools available for manufacturing spectacle are so sophisticated that they can temporarily mask the absence of authentic emotional logic. But here's the thing about X-Men, Apocalypse, those authentic emotional moments exist. They're distributed unevenly across the film, showing up in sequences where the technical craft and the character work happen to be pointing in the same direction at the same time. When that alignment occurs, Fassbender in Auschwitz, Turner in the Phoenix Fire, Smith, McPhee in mid-flight over Cairo, the film becomes something genuinely special. A big, expensive, technically ambitious superhero movie that occasionally, improbably, feels like it means something. That's not nothing. In fact, for a film this large, operating under this much franchise pressure, it's quite a lot. Every movie is about something on the surface. X-Men, Apocalypse is about an immortal mutant trying to destroy civilization with 4 enhanced warriors while a group of extraordinary young people try to stop him. That's the plot. That's the surface. But movies worth analyzing are always about something else underneath, something the plot is a delivery mechanism for, a set of ideas that the story keeps circling back to even when the characters aren't consciously articulating them. The best superhero films understand this intuitively. They use genre machinery, the costumes, the powers, the world-ending stakes, as a pressure system for ideas that would be harder to examine in more realistic dramatic contexts. The distance of the fantastic lets you look directly at things that feel too hot to approach head-on. X-Men, Apocalypse has more thematic content than its reputation suggests. Some of it is carefully developed. Some of it is gestured at rather than fully realized. All of it is worth taking seriously, because the X-Men franchise has never been content to be merely entertaining, and the ideas embedded in this specific entry say something specific about the particular cultural moment it was made for. The evolution argument, and why Apocalypse is wrong in an interesting way. The X-Men are, at their conceptual core, a story about evolution. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created them in 1963 as a metaphor for civil rights, for the idea that the newest variation of humanity is not a threat to what came before, but simply what comes next. The word mutant carries all the weight of every slur ever applied to any group that a dominant culture decided to define as other. Mutation in the X-Men universe isn't a disease or a defect. It's the engine of species development. It's how life improves itself over time. Apocalypse is, on the surface, a character who believes this more completely than anyone else in the franchise. He calls himself the natural order personified. He advocates, explicitly and consistently, for the survival of the fittest, for letting the strong replace the weak, for removing the artificial protections that civilization provides to forms of life that wouldn't otherwise persist. His argument, stripped to its philosophical skeleton, is a version of social Darwinism, evolution as moral framework, fitness as virtue, survival as the only legitimate form of success. Here's what makes this philosophically interesting rather than just villainous. He's not entirely wrong about the biological facts. Evolution does proceed through selective pressure. Organisms that can't adapt to changing environments do get replaced by ones that can. These are not contested observations, they're descriptive of how life actually works. What Apocalypse gets catastrophically, fatally wrong, is the leap from descriptive to prescriptive. The fact that evolution operates through selective pressure does not make selective pressure a moral good. The fact that some organisms are better adapted to current conditions than others does not make adaptability synonymous with worth. The entire architecture of human civilization, everything from medicine to law to art, is, in one sense, an argument against pure natural selection. It's the species deciding, collectively, that it will protect its most vulnerable members rather than let them be eliminated, that it will value things that have no survival utility, beauty, kindness, narrative, love. Charles Xavier's entire philosophy is, at its root, a counter-argument to Apocalypse's, and it's not a naive one. Charles doesn't argue that everyone is equally powerful or equally capable or equally adapted to every environment. He argues that equality of worth is not a factual claim. It's a chosen value, something a civilization decides to believe because the alternative is a world that none of its members would actually want to live in, regardless of where they sit in the fitness hierarchy. Today's apex predator is tomorrow's evolutionary dead end. The calculus of strength changes too fast to build an ethics on. The film is most intellectually honest about this tension in its treatment of Magneto, who occupies a position between the two philosophies without quite belonging to either. Eric doesn't believe in Xavier's universal worth, but he doesn't believe in Apocalypse's pure strength hierarchy either. Not actually, not in his marrow, not even when he's wearing the helmet and pulling the planet apart. What Eric believes is something more personal and less abstract than either position, that specific people deserve protection, that the murder of the particular and irreplaceable, his parents, his wife, his daughter, is the thing that matters morally, not where anyone falls on a spectrum of genetic fitness. His break from Apocalypse in Cairo is not an ideological conversion. Eric doesn't suddenly agree with Charles that all life has equal worth. He just rediscovers that he has specific, untheoretical attachment to Charles, to the idea of what the school represents, that Apocalypse's abstracted vision of a cleansed world cannot accommodate. He's not choosing Xavier's philosophy over Apocalypse. He's choosing the particular over the abstract, people over concepts. And that, the film quietly argues, is where morality actually lives, not in grand theories of evolution or survival, but in the irreducible specificity of the people standing in front of you. GRI. In the 5 years preceding its release, the world had watched, repeatedly, and with increasing bewilderment, the process by which ordinary people, people with families, jobs, communities, recognizable human needs, were radicalized into violent extremism. The mechanisms of that radicalization were endlessly debated in newspapers and academic papers and government policy. But the most consistent factor, cutting across cultural and religious and political contexts, was something simpler and older than ideology: grief, loss, the specific devastation of having the world prove definitively and personally that it doesn't value what you value. Apocalypse recruits through grief. Every horseman he finds is someone whose particular pain has left them open to the offer he makes, which is not fundamentally an offer of power. It's an offer of significance. The world hurt you. What if that hurt meant something? What if, rather than being random and meaningless, your suffering was preparation, evidence of selection, proof that you were always meant for more than what the world was willing to offer you? This is the seductive logic of radicalization stated plainly, and the film renders it with uncomfortable accuracy in the Magneto sequence specifically. Apocalypse doesn't lie to Eric. He doesn't offer him false comfort or manufactured meaning. He offers him a framework in which what happened in Poland is not meaningless violence but confirmation of a truth. Eric already suspected that attempting integration with a world that fears you has a cost, and that cost is paid in people you love. The framework is monstrous, but the underlying observation, that Eric tried and the world punished him for it, is factually accurate. That's what makes it work. Radicalization almost never operates through pure deception. It operates through partial truths aimed at people whose defenses are already weakened by suffering. Storm's recruitment follows the same logic. She lives in poverty in Cairo, her power barely controlled, her survival dependent on petty theft, her ambitions permanently capped by circumstances she didn't choose and can't change through ordinary means. Apocalypse finds her at the precise intersection of genuine grievance and available rage, and what he offers her, the removal of limits, is indistinguishable in the first moment of receiving it from justice. Only later, watching what that unlimited power actually serves, does the bargain become visible for what it is. The film's most important thematic statement about grief and radicalization comes not from the villain's side, but from Xavier's response to it. Charles knows with painful intimacy why Eric went where he went. He knows the logic. He's heard it in Eric's voice across 2 previous films. And his counter to it is not an argument, it's continued presence. The consistent, costly, often rebuffed act of remaining available to someone who has decided you represent a position they've rejected. That posture, staying rather than arguing, witnessing rather than debating, is not passive. It's the most exhausting form of resistance available to someone whose weapon is connection rather than force. It doesn't always work. The film is honest about that. Sometimes Eric still leaves. Sometimes the grief is louder than the friendship. But sometimes, in Cairo, in the specific moment when the world is ending partly because of choices Eric made, the frequency Charles has always been transmitting on gets through. And that's the best available outcome. Not conversion, not agreement, just reception. The burden of worship, gods and their descants. There's a theological thread running through X-Men, Apocalypse, that doesn't get discussed enough. The film is, among other things, a story about what happens to beings who are treated as divine. Apocalypse has been worshipped. For thousands of years, across dozens of civilizations, under dozens of names, he has occupied the space that humans reserve for the incomprehensible, the divine. And what the film shows us, gradually, is what being treated as a god does to a consciousness that is, whatever else it may be, still a living thing with a living thing's need for challenge and response and genuine encounter. Apocalypse is not terrible because he's evil, exactly. He's terrible because he's been treated as beyond evaluation for so long that he's lost the capacity to be genuinely surprised. He can't learn anything anymore because learning requires the possibility of being wrong, and nothing in his experience has been wrong in a very long time. The cult that buried him in the Egyptian prologue wasn't wrong to be afraid of what he was becoming. They were right. But their act of betrayal, the only genuinely novel thing to happen to him in centuries, was the last time something unpredictable occurred in his world. Since then, it's just been confirmation. Every civilization confirms the same thesis. Everything confirms that he was right. And being always right is, it turns out, its own particular form of imprisonment. Jean Grey is the thematic answer to this. Her power is comparable to Apocalypse's in scale. The Phoenix Force is, by most measures available in this film, in the same league as the most powerful being who ever lived. But Jean is not worshipped. She's not even fully acknowledged. She's managed, supervised, contained, gently administered by a school that loves her, but fundamentally doesn't know what to do with her. And paradoxically, that imperfect, insufficient, completely human response to her extraordinary existence is what keeps her reachable, what keeps her capable of choosing. Apocalypse, treated as God for millennia, can no longer make genuine choices. He can only perform the options available to something of his magnitude. Jean, treated as a problem that the people around her care about solving, remains a person. The gap between those two outcomes, between the God who can't be surprised and the girl who hasn't been fully seen yet, is the film's central argument about power. Being known imperfectly by people who love you imperfectly is not a diminishment. It's the thing that makes will possible. It's the thing that keeps you choosing rather than simply being. Charles understands this about Jean in the film's closing moments. His decision not to rebuild the full wall around her power, to allow her a genuine relationship with what she is rather than a managed distance from it, is the film's clearest statement of its values. Not safety, not control, not the benign administration of extraordinary things for the comfort of ordinary ones. Just, here you are, stay. The generation question. What gets passed down and what gets left behind? X-Men. Apocalypse arrives at a specific moment in the prequel trilogy's arc, the moment when the characters who have been carrying this story for 3 films step back and let someone else carry it forward. This isn't just franchise logistics, it's a genuine thematic interest. What does one generation pass to the next? What do they owe the young? What do the young owe in return? The film doesn't answer these questions with tidy resolution. It holds them open in ways that honor their complexity. Charles passes to the young X-Men his institutional structure, the school, the training, the framework for thinking about mutation as potential rather than threat. But he also, visibly, passes his uncertainty, his partial maps, his unfinished arguments with the world. The school he's built is genuine and valuable and also clearly incomplete. He's figured out how to create an environment where extraordinary young people can develop. He hasn't figured out what they should do with that development once it outgrows the environment. Raven passes something harder to name. She passes a template for imperfect heroism, for the idea that you don't have to resolve your own contradictions before being useful, that you could be simultaneously uncertain and effective, simultaneously reluctant and necessary, simultaneously scared and present. The mythology that built up around her blue-skinned symbol was about a decisive revolutionary. The reality she passes on to the next generation is messier and more valuable, that decisiveness is sometimes performed after the fact, that the myth of certainty is a construction, and that acting in the absence of certainty is the only heroism that's actually available. Eric passes almost nothing conscious. He leaves. But his departure is itself a lesson, a demonstration, visible to every young mutant watching, of what happens when grief doesn't get enough light. When pain calcifies around itself instead of being witnessed and shared. Eric's arc across 3 films is the cautionary tale the school's very existence is responding to. Charles built the school because of what happened to Eric. In that sense, Nina's death and Magda's death, and the awful Polish forest, those are in the walls of the mansion in Westchester, present in every room where a frightened young mutant learns they don't have to be alone in what they are. The young generation, Scott, Jean, Kurt, Aurora, inherits all of this. The school's idealism and its blind spots. Mystique's imperfect courage. Magneto's warning. They don't start clean. Nobody starts clean. They start with the accumulated weight of everything that came before them, and the film's most honest final image is of them in the training room. Not triumphant, not certain, not free from the history they've just been handed. Just present. Together. Beginning. Mutant as metaphor. What 1983 means in 2016. The original X-Men comics were a civil rights metaphor. By 2016, the franchise had consciously expanded that metaphorical register to include LGBTQ+ identity. X2's famous, "Have you tried not being a mutant?" scene operates almost entirely as a coming-out narrative, and Days of Future Past used the mutant registration debates as a lens for examining contemporary surveillance and state violence against minority populations. X-Men. Apocalypse is set in 1983, and that date is not incidental. 1983 is the early AIDS crisis. It's the Reagan-era's specific hostility toward the communities whose experiences the X-Men metaphor had always been invoking. It's a period when the question of whether certain people deserve protection from the state, deserve to be acknowledged as fully human by the society they were part of, was being answered in policy with a consistent and devastating no. The film doesn't address this explicitly. It's a superhero blockbuster, not a historical drama. But the setting makes it available as context for every scene where a mutant faces the choice of hiding or being seen. Eric's Polish life is built on hiding. Jean's daily management of her power is a form of hiding. Even Charles's school, tucked away in Westchester behind psychic wards and electronic security, is a form of strategic invisibility, a community keeping itself safe from a world that hasn't decided yet whether safety is something they deserve. Apocalypse's appeal, understood in this context, is the appeal of radical visibility over strategic concealment. He doesn't hide. He never has. His offer to the Horsemen is, partly, an offer to stop hiding, to occupy the world fully and loudly and without apology. That's a recognizable appeal. The problem, as the film and the franchise and the history of civil rights movements all know, is that pure visibility without community, declaration without solidarity, tends to produce martyrdom rather than liberation. What the school offers, by contrast, is collective visibility within a protected space that can expand as the world becomes safer to expand into. That's not the same as hiding. It's more like the historical process by which marginalized communities build internal institutions strong enough to eventually change external conditions. Slow, uncertain, dependent on the next generation being willing to continue it. Radically unglamorous compared to the ancient god demanding worship in Cairo. But look at who's still standing at the end of the film. Look at who built something that will outlast them. The school is still there. The door is still open. That's the X-Men thesis across 6 decades of stories, across 9 films, across every iteration of this mythology the culture has produced. Not that being extraordinary makes you powerful. That being extraordinary and together makes you resilient. That the school, imperfect, incomplete, constantly in danger of being blown up by the various apocalypses that keep finding their way to Westchester, is worth rebuilding every single time. Because the alternative is Sabah standing alone on a pyramid in the desert, the most powerful being alive, absolutely certain of everything, with no one left who can surprise him. That's not strength. That's the loneliest thing imaginable. When X-Men Apocalypse opened in May 2016, it walked into one of the most competitive weekends in superhero cinema history. Captain America: Civil War had opened 3 weeks earlier and was still pulling massive numbers. The conversation around superhero films had shifted from enthusiasm to something more evaluative. Critics were now grading on a curve that accounted for audience fatigue, for the accumulated weight of a genre that had been producing 2 or 3 major releases per year for nearly a decade. The goodwill that Days of Future Past had generated for the Fox X-Men series was real but finite. And Apocalypse, arriving in that particular atmosphere, got a response that was neither condemnation nor celebration, but something harder to navigate: qualified disappointment. The numbers told one version of the story. $543 million worldwide on a $178 million production budget is, by any objective measure, a profitable film. It's not a failure, it's not a disaster. By the standards of most studio productions in any genre, it's a success. But franchise economics don't work on absolute terms, they work on trajectory. And Days of Future Past had made $746 million. First Class had made $353 million on a smaller budget with lower expectations. The trajectory suggested upward momentum that Apocalypse interrupted, and Hollywood reads interruptions as statements. The critical reception landed at 47% on Rotten Tomatoes, the worst score any mainline X-Men film had received since X-Men Origins: Wolverine in 2009. The consensus criticized what most critics experienced as a diffuse narrative. Too many characters, not enough focus, a villain who occupied enormous screen time without generating proportionate dread. Those criticisms were not entirely wrong. They were also not the whole picture. Critics processing 104 minutes in a single sitting under review conditions have a different relationship to a film's pacing problems than audiences who surrender to it over a long weekend. The consensus calcified around the weakest elements. The strongest ones: Fassbender's performance, the Quicksilver sequence, the Phoenix conclusion, got acknowledged, but somehow didn't shift the verdict. What the critical reception missed, or underweighted, was the degree to which Apocalypse was doing something structurally unusual for a film of its type, deliberately diminishing its own most marketable elements in order to establish the next generation of the franchise. The film actively reduces Magneto's narrative prominence in its third act, not because the screenplay forgot about him, but because his arc concludes at Auschwitz and in Cairo, and anything after that is epilogue. It gives its most spectacular sequence not to its hero or its villain, but to a supporting character with a minor role in the larger franchise hierarchy. It ends, not with its established stars, but with 5 20-year-olds standing in a training room. These are not the choices of a film that doesn't know what it's doing. They're the choices of a film making a long-term bet. investing in futures rather than cashing in on the established present. Whether that bet paid off is a more complicated question than the Rotten Tomatoes score suggests. What it set up X-Men. Apocalypse was designed as the first chapter of a story that would carry Ty Sheridan's Cyclops, Sophie Turner's Jean Grey, and Cody Smith-McPhee's Nightcrawler forward into their own franchise era. The next film, Dark Phoenix, released in 2019, would take Jean Grey's arc exactly where Apocalypse pointed it, toward the full, catastrophic realization of the Phoenix Force, and toward the question of whether Jean Grey is a person or a weapon, and whether the X-Men's instinct to protect her is actually serving her or themselves. Dark Phoenix is a deeply troubled film for reasons that have been extensively documented. Reshoots, a changing competitive landscape following the Disney-Fox acquisition announcement, a production environment in which nobody was entirely sure whether the story being told would have any franchise continuation to justify it. Watching it now, with full knowledge of the context, it's impossible to separate what the film is from what the circumstances forced it to become. But what's interesting, in retrospect, is how clearly X-Men Apocalypse prepared its emotional groundwork. The Jean Grey that Sophie Turner plays in Dark Phoenix is recognizably, specifically, continuous with the Jean Grey established in Apocalypse. The nightmare sequences, the wall, the exhaustion, the terror of her own scale, all of it is carried forward intact. Whatever Dark Phoenix's structural failures, they aren't failures of character continuity with this film. The young ensemble, Sheridan, Turner, Smith, McPhee, Ship, never quite got the franchise era they were set up for, which is one of the genuine losses of the Fox X-Men series' ending. There's a version of X-Men, Dark Phoenix, that works as a natural culmination of what Apocalypse established. That version exists in outline if not in execution. And the young cast, for all the production turbulence around them, showed up for their films with consistent commitment and real chemistry. They deserved a cleaner runway. The franchise in full, where Apocalypse sits, looking at the Fox X-Men franchise as a complete body of work. 19 years, 13 films, from Bryan Singer's X-Men in 2000 to Dark Phoenix in 2019. Apocalypse occupies a specific, legible position. It's the hinge point, the place where the old generation exits and the new one enters, where the prequel trilogy that began with First Class closes its primary arcs, where the mythology stops belonging to McAvoy and Fassbender and Lawrence alone and gets distributed to a wider ensemble. Hinge points are inherently awkward. They have to simultaneously close and open, pay off and set up, honor what's ending, and make the audience care about what's beginning. The films that do this best, The Empire Strikes Back, The Two Towers, The Winter Soldier, manage the transition by making the hinge itself emotionally rich, not just structurally functional. Apocalypse achieves this in its best moments and fumbles it in its most mechanical one. The connective tissue between those two achievements is sometimes efficient and sometimes perfunctory. But place it next to the franchise's comparable hinge points, X-Men, The Last Stand, which attempted a similar generational transition and fumbled it far more completely, sacrificing character coherence for spectacle in ways that took the franchise nearly a decade to recover from. And Apocalypse looks considerably more accomplished than its reputation allows. It closes 3 character arcs with genuine integrity. It introduces 5 new characters who feel like people rather than plot functions. It makes specific, defensible choices about what to prioritize, even when those choices disappoint segments of the audience. That's not nothing. In franchise filmmaking, where the gravitational pull toward the safe and the familiar is enormous, those choices represent real creative courage. The MCU. Question: what comes next for these characters? The Disney acquisition of 21st Century Fox in 2019 effectively ended the Fox X-Men universe. Dark Phoenix became the de facto final chapter of a 19-year franchise. The rights to the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and associated properties reverted to Disney and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the franchise that has spent 2 decades operating in parallel with Fox's X-Men while being legally prevented from using mutation as an origin story. The MCU's eventual incorporation of mutants, beginning with scattered references in Ms. Marvel and the Marvels, and moving toward whatever full X-Men integration is currently being developed, will necessarily involve a complete creative reboot. The McAvoy-Fassbender Lawrence version of these characters will not be continued in the MCU. New actors, new designs, new origin stories, new franchise context. That's the nature of intellectual property migration at this scale. What this means for X-Men Apocalypse is that it now exists as a closed artifact rather than a chapter in a continuing story. It can be evaluated purely on its own terms without the weight of franchise obligation that partially colored its original reception. And evaluated on those terms, as a standalone examination of a mythology, a character study embedded in a superhero narrative, a technically ambitious blockbuster with genuine emotional ambitions. It holds up better than the 2016 consensus suggested. Here's the thing about superhero films that become franchise orphans. They sometimes reveal qualities that were invisible when the films were operating as chapters in a larger story. When you're not assessing Apocalypse as a stepping stone to the next Fox X-Men film, when you're just watching what it is, the things that work become more visible. The Auschwitz sequence, the Quicksilver rescue, the Phoenix conclusion. Michael Fassbender putting on that helmet in what might be, given how the franchise ended, his final substantive scene as this character. These moments don't need franchise context to function. They just need a viewer willing to give them the attention they were built for. The Hunnis Ledger X-Men Apocalypse is not a great film. It's too uneven for that designation, too willing to let its weakest elements coast while its strongest ones do extra work to compensate. The villain problem is real. The second act pacing problems are real. The treatment of several supporting characters, Psylocke, Angel, Havoc, is genuinely insufficient for the talent and the material available. But the film contains great things. Definitively, indisputably great things. Michael Fassbender delivers one of the finest performances in the superhero genre across this film's runtime, a performance that operates on multiple psychological registers simultaneously without ever becoming incoherent or theatrical. Sophie Turner establishes Jean Grey with a specificity and consistency that the subsequent film, for all its production challenges, was able to build on directly. The Quicksilver rescue is one of the most technically accomplished action sequences in franchise cinema of this era. The Auschwitz photography is among the most morally serious filmmaking this genre has produced. The thematic architecture, grief as radicalization, power as isolation, the particular value of imperfect community, is more sophisticated than the film usually gets credit for. That gap between what the film is and what it contains is the most interesting thing about X-Men, Apocalypse, as an object of study. It's a film that exceeds itself in specific moments. A film where the craft and the intention and the performance periodically align to produce something genuinely moving inside a structure that is periodically failing to hold everything together. That description, it turns out, fits a lot of things worth caring about. Closing. The pyramid in the school. Sabah Noor built a pyramid. He spent thousands of years accumulating power, conquering bodies, absorbing abilities, constructing a monument to the idea that strength is its own justification and survival is its own morality. The pyramid rises from the city, perfect and geometric and enormous, demanding acknowledgement of its own scale. And the X-Men knock it down, not with superior force. They don't have superior force, not against what Apocalypse has assembled. They knock it down with something that his entire framework cannot account for, the specific, unreasonable decision of several frightened young people to stand in front of something overwhelming rather than run from it. Scott Summers, who spent most of his life terrified of his own eyes, opens them. Jean Grey, who built her entire psychology around containing what she is, lets it go. Kurt Wagner, who was locked in a cage and forced to fight for someone else's entertainment, bounces through a burning sky because he wants to, because this is what his body was made for, because joy is a form of resistance. The pyramid falls. The school gets rebuilt. The door stays open. Charles Xavier has been rebuilding that school, in one form or another, since 1963. Each generation of students finds it damaged or destroyed or under threat, and each generation helps put it back together and keeps it running for the next one. There's something almost liturgical about this repetition across 60-plus years of X-Men stories. The regularity with which catastrophe finds the school and the equal regularity with which the school survives it. As if the mythology is insisting, through sheer narrative repetition, on a specific point about what is and isn't durable. Pyramids, it turns out, are fragile. They're made from the available material of a single era, assembled according to the logic of a single moment's power structure, designed to last but dependent on the conditions of their construction remaining stable. The moment those conditions shift, the moment a girl who was never supposed to be this powerful opens her eyes in Cairo, the pyramid is already over. Schools are different. They don't depend on a single arrangement of power. They depend on the ongoing decision of people to show up, to teach what they know, to learn what they don't, to make room for whoever comes through the door next. They get damaged. They get rebuilt. They absorb new students with new problems and new forms of extraordinary into the same basic structure, and they keep operating. X-Men. Apocalypse is a movie about the end of the world, about an immortal being with the power to remake civilization, standing at the center of a ruined city, waiting for the strong to inherit what he's cleared away. But it's also, quietly, Persistently, in the margins of every scene where a frightened teenager learns to open their eyes, to use their power without destroying the room, to find someone else who knows what it's like. A movie about what survives the end of the world. Not the pyramids. Never the pyramid. The school. Always the school.